This is an interview with my friend Stephen Watt. While on ketamine, he wrote a piece of computer code that resulted in a 2-year prison sentence and $171.5 million in restitution. He is the only person in history to have entered a $171.5 million K-hole. And if anyone has some perspective on what can potentially go wrong in the context of ketamine use, it is my friend Stephen. As you will hear, this conversation is very nuanced. It's not a scare story about ketamine. In fact, he remains a ketamine proponent, but someone who has a particular insight into what can happen when somebody has certain responsibilities and abilities and is extremely high on ketamine, how slight perturbations of one's judgment can have catastrophic effects. I honestly think virtually everything said about ketamine here also applies to drugs like alcohol, but we do have some very interesting discussions about the history of hacking, what it means to LARP as a sober person, what to do when you are raided by police, the role of snitches in criminal prosecution, the malevolent government prosecutor who led to the suicide of Aaron Swartz, who also was the prosecutor for Stephen Watt, the bizarre convergences between Stephen Watt and myself, and so much else. Stephen Watt is a truly extraordinary person. He's one of the strangest people I've ever known. I've brought him up several times on this podcast previously, either by name or hinted at him, because it's not every day that a 7-foot-tall bodybuilder hacker writes you when they get out of prison saying that they'll train you to get ripped, which is what he did. We used to go to the gym together. I never got ripped, but he taught me an enormous amount about steroids and the supplement industry, and the stories that he has to tell are so extraordinary that if I didn't know for a fact they were true and know many of the people involved myself, I would consider them unbelievable. He has an entirely unique perspective on this issue of how ketamine influences people's behavior, and I think this is a beneficial perspective. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. There's a lot more coming out soon. I've wanted to interview you actually for a long time because you have one of the weirdest stories that I'm aware of. I've probably talked about you without saying your name a few times on the podcast before because it's...
Is that a qualified weird story, or is that like a weird story of a crime committed on ketamine? Because I feel like I've seen a lot of your episodes, from dancing with Hasidic Jews on LSD to the Pickard and Apperson LSD silo. So I'm a little bit baffled that I would be up in the pantheon of weird cases. But
well, there were so many weird. Like the story itself is weird. Then it was. I think you first reach out to me while you were still in prison. Is that possible?
Oh, I do not remember, but I remember the first time I heard your name. And of course, I would have probably known of you earlier. So I was essentially banned from using any kind of modern technology while I was on pretrial. And that was when I tendered my plea at the end of 2008. So from 2008 onward, I would have essentially been cut off from internet-y type interesting stuff. One of the things I did planning for prison, because I was very adamant that the government can take my body, but they can't rob me of my time. And I went in with this G.I. Jane type mentality of concerted monasticism and self-study. And so one of the things that I did was amass a massive Amazon reading list of various classic, critically acclaimed literature and nonfiction topics that interested me. And I also curated a periodical list. So if I recall correctly, my subscription was something to the effect of the New York Times for my daily newspaper. I got everything except the additional cooking section or whatever they charge you a couple extra dollars for. Of course, the New Yorker was supreme on my list, but then I had Wired, Vanity Fair, Rolling Stone, The Nation, Mother Jones, The New Republic, Scientific American, Scientific American Mind. I think I had Life Extension magazine. I had at least one bodybuilding magazine called Muscular Development. And then, of course, I'm pretty sure I'm missing a thing or two, but the one I left for the end is Harper's. And some of this stuff I actually got turned on to. So the best conversations I had during my pretrial period were journalists who reached out to me to hear about my story. And funny enough, I found I really got a kick out of talking to a few of these journalists because they had written all sorts of stories on all sorts of topics. You know, they kind of do the rounds between whatever Condé Nast publication is currently paying the bills for them, but very well broadly read. And they sort of tuned me on to some of the classic cases of, I don't know what the proper nomenclature would be. It's not really gonzo journalism, but it's like this new school narrative, nonfiction, investigative journalism. So I was aware of, for example, in Harper, they had this infamous article about black kid, autistic kid who hops on the subway and conducts them for fun. And he's been put in jail and various institutions just for this extremely innocent desire to be an unauthorized MTA transit worker. And another one was the story of Billy Mitchell, which got immortalized as the documentary King of Kong. And I guess I would describe it as a story of intrigue between two different people competing for the world record score Donkey Kong game. And they were supposed to be cheating, and Billy Mitchell was this mullet-haired, slick villain, which sounds like he's a complete dork, but actually when compared to the rest of the top gamers in the world, he's kind of like a Lothario. But in any case, before that became a documentary, that was originally a piece of journalism in Harper. So, you know, Harper's okay. I'm not there to read the 200-year retrospective on Charlotte Bronte's personal diary, but at the same time, if you're patient, there's always something interesting in every edition. Oh, I forgot the Atlantic, of course. The Atlantic was another publication I felt more clever about. I guess it's turned into a popular journal of the resistance, which is not a problem for me personally, but it was a little more obscure back in 2007. I remember actually I was inspired by the TV show The Wire, and I don't know if you've watched it.
Oh, I know. I haven't watched it, but I know exactly what you're referencing.
Brother Mouzone?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And, he scolds one of his underlings, and he says something like, "Where is my Harper's? I told you to get me my Harper's." And for some reason, I was watching that show. I caught up on it on my way into prison. I was, of course, watching it on DVD from Netflix. And funny enough, I had to actually illegally add titles to my Netflix DVD queue, because one of the things that we petitioned the court about was the restrictions on me were like, I'm not allowed to use such and such manner of electronic devices, including phones, which were not smart at that time, but many of still did have internet connections via GPRS or Edge or whatever. That was back in the day when Nokia and Symbian were still a thing. And of course, no laptops or computers. And so one of the things we said was, okay, the defendant, he's at home on pretrial, not allowed to use computers, not really allowed to do anything, because that really hamstrung me from getting work. I live in Greenwich Village, and I remember soon after getting fired, my mom was on my ass to stop moping around and try to do something for work. And so I obliged her, and I walked up the streets to the McDonald's that I think is on like between 15th and 16th on 6th. And I remember going in there really self-consciously as a 7-foot man in good shape, looking to apply for a job. And I remember asking them, hey, where can I find an application? And the woman pointed at the kiosk and she said, you fill it out right here. And so I walked out, because I was legally not allowed to use a touch screen to enter my information into the kiosk. And I see your face right now. There's like a little bit of like, I don't know, incredulity or humor, but this whole thing happened when I got out from prison. I was on pretrial managing a supplement store, and the cash register was actually powered by a Windows XP computer that was inside a cabinet under the desk, but it was wired to a touchscreen monitor where you could use a numeric pad to enter 32.99, and that was an issue with my probation officer, that I was typing in numbers onto an electronic touchscreen.
And for context, what year is this?
That I got out or that I went in?
That you were having these struggles with employment.
Oh, well, but I described two cases because one of them was pre-trial and one of them was post-trial.
Okay, pre-trial.
Pre-trial would have been roughly between the second half of 2008 and roughly until the end of 2009. At a certain point, I actually gave up and started collecting unemployment because I've always been a law-abiding, tax-paying citizen. So I was able to collect that from the state of New York. And I remember you have to go in there to the office if you're collecting and indefinitely, and you have to show some kind of evidence that you're actively pursuing gainful employment. And they'd ask me, what did you look for? And I'm like, well, here's my court restrictions. I don't really know what I should look for. Can you suggest a job that will pay me more per month than the unemployment that I collect? And every single time I went in there, the person just looked at me with a puzzled expression and said, okay, you're free to go. So I collected my unemployment check every week until I finally went to prison. But anyhow, Harper's was, I don't know if you call it a meme. It made like a mimetic imprint in my memory. So every time I would collect my monthly Harper's from the mail call, I'd hear like this echo of Brother Mouzone from The Wire with his bow tie saying, where's my Harper's, motherfucker? And one of those months that I got Harper's, there was a very interesting article about demystifying the Voodoo mystery, which of course I think you talked about was like a dendrotoxin.
Tetrodotoxin. TTX.
Yeah. And so I remember reading about that and the exploration of the myth of the Voodoo, I don't know if you call it a practitioner or subject or I don't know.
Or even a religion.
Oh, I mean the individual who has been resurrected.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a term for that I've forgotten?
Zombie.
Okay, maybe I'm trying too hard to come up with the right word. Yeah, okay. I'm using scare quotes right now, the zombie, because you can't see it on the tape. So it was interesting seeing the convergence of the legend of this zombie and then the neuropharmacological explanation behind it. And to blow smoke up your ass, but I was so impressed by that article, the fact that it was such an outlier for Harper's, right? Because Harper's is known for having sent the occasional oddball article, but again, this is still even like a little bit in left field for Harper's. And then after that, I think I sent out a probe in my mail to my ex-wife that she used to publish a couple paragraphs of what I wrote. She would transcribe it onto my Facebook page. And I think I probably said something to the effect of, holy shit, my mind was blown by this article by a guy named Hamilton Morris I'd never heard of. If anybody has some more interesting stuff by him, please send it in. And I don't remember who heeded the call, but I think some months after that, I ended up getting a printout that you did of methoxetamine or rafflecopters or whatever the synthetic ketamine analog was.
Yeah.
So I remember reading that and I was fascinated. And of course, ketamine has long been my favorite drug of any for a number of reasons that I'm assuming we're here to talk about today. And I remember thinking, holy shit, like there's some sort of like gas station boner pill version of this that's like still available through some sort of legal loophole in the way that K2 or whatever is. And I hope I'm released from prison soon enough that I can try this, because they're sure as hell not going to be able to test for it on a piss test probation. You know, they can't even do a piss test for ketamine, right? It's like beyond the feeble power of their 5 or 7 or 10 panel drug test, right? My ketamine dealer was arrested, and I remember his probation conditions, and it was some kind of absurd fee that set the taxpayers of New York back $1,000 every time this kid pissed into a cup. So I was pretty sure that if I came out and tried some much cheaper rafflecopters or whatever they were called at the time, that it would be a great way to reintegrate myself into society as a law-abiding citizen. And that was courtesy to the information that you provide as a public service.
Oh, good. Yes, I remember getting this message from you. And as I recall, you said something about when you got out, you would train me, or that you would offer me free training. Okay.
I remember this. Okay. I started this thing a little bit before I went in. It was during the time period when I received my sentence and when I actually reported to jail. So I received my sentence, which was 2 years incarceration, 3 years supervised release, and a $171.5 million restitution. I
$171.5 million restitution.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, you do know that fact, but maybe you forgot.
I had forgotten that it was that. I remember thinking that it was over $1 million. I'd forgotten that it was over
$1 million. I'd actually have a chance to pay that back over a lifetime. I am a software developer, but I'm not a startup founder. Yeah. So I believe it was the last day of court before Christmas break. That much I do remember. I'd like to say that it was either December 20th or December 22nd of 2009 that I received that sentence. And I ended up having to self-report to prison at the beginning of May of 2010. So that left me with roughly 5 months or so to contemplate my fate. By that time, I had some degree of official notoriety because of the articles and whatnot that have been written about me. But if you're prudent and you're following your lawyer's advice is always going to be to shut the fuck up and, follow my lead and don't speak to the press and stay silent and don't antagonize the judge or the prosecution and abide by all of your pretrial restrictions. And I did that. But once sentencing happened, that window broke a little bit. And so one of the first things that started happening was my lawyer started alerting me. He kind of like gave me over like a pile of email that he had printed up that was from like journalists who were interested in talking to me that he decided to protect me from until my fate was sealed. And I talked to a couple of them, hence some of the things I mentioned to you earlier. But another thing that I did was there were a couple people that I had read, usually like authors or bloggers or some people that the writing resonated for me. And these people didn't necessarily have anything to do with computers. So for example, I used to follow this guy, Anthony Roberts, who was a total gadfly and whistleblower and very uncomfortable truth teller in the whole bodybuilding, sports supplement, exercise science scene. I sent him a letter one day saying something to the effect of, hey, I feel like you're kind of like me if we were in completely different worlds. And I sent a copy of some of my press, and he got back to me right away and came to visit me. And we hit it off, became best friends. And so I realized sometimes all you have to do is put yourself out there and reach out and just try to do it in a very straightforward and concise fashion, especially if you're dealing with somebody that gets a lot of crazed mail, as I'm sure somebody like yourself does, right? I'm not normally a calculating person, but I can imagine that you get all sorts of crazy requests, and you need to cut through that pretty quickly with some kind of interesting thing. And from reading your Harper's article and from reading your other writing on methoxetamine, I reached out to you after prison. I knew you lived in New York, and I was super curious to meet you and pick your mind.
Since the early 18th century, ethnographic reports have documented the Chukchi practice of drinking urine infused with the metabolites of the psychoactive mushroom Amanita muscaria.
Oh. There's got to be a better way.
Amanterra.com offers gummies infused with 100 milligrams of Amanita muscaria extract. Use the discount code Hamilton for 22% off any of Amanterra's ethnobotanical offerings.
I had been doing everything as a sort of solo psychonaut. I'm not a chemist. I've never synthesized anything. I've never grown my own mushrooms. All I've done is like crush my own very high purity crystals of MDMA into tiny grains so that I can insufflate them. Like that's the extent of like my mechanical pharmacy skills. But I sort of worked my way through the canonical literature of the psychedelics and prided myself on trying everything at least once and certain things many more times than once. And you had this super interesting job. Now, the grass is always greener from the other side, as they say. You might get a mail from me and you see my case and you're like, wow, that looks pretty cool. This guy was into a bunch of computer systems and stole a bunch of money and blah, blah, blah. And I'm so burnt out on that shit. I don't care. I never think about it anymore. But at the same time, what you do, for example, you seem to have a dream job. People look at my situation when I was busted, and I was writing software at Morgan Stanley, and I was doing like heroic amounts of psychedelic drugs on the weekend and sometimes on the weekdays. And some people find that interesting, but I actually thought what you were doing, which is becoming like a bona fide journalist, chronicling some of the crazier stories in the realms of drug use and drug abuse and drug overuse and drug misadventures and auto pharmacy. I thought your job was super cool. And I just wanted to pick your brain. I wanted to learn something from you. You know, it's not that much of a different impulse from wanting to break into somebody's computer and read proprietary source code. You want to learn something that interests you that is not in the public domain. And I really like the stuff that you put out into the public domain. And I'm not saying that I necessarily wanted to learn your secrets, but I wanted to absorb more information. I wanted to absorb as much information from you as possible because like we are mutually fascinated by the same subject area, and I'm an autodidact or a dabbler or a dilettante or whatever you want to call it, and you're one of the only people on the planet that has actually turned this into a profession. So I reached out to you, and I also thought that my story would be of interest to you because there is a very bizarre detail about it that I think we both agree is crazy, which is I have committed the most notorious white-collar crime in history under the influence of sub-anesthetic ketamine. Not to say that many crimes could be committed in proper anesthesia. At least, I guess a crime could be committed against you, but I don't know that you'd be able to commit some against somebody else. So that was my opening line to you. I said something to that effect. Hey, I got this story for you. I think you're going to find it really bizarre. You're going to find it really bizarre, the fact that the government is accusing me of furthering a conspiracy by modifying code on ketamine. And of course, the subtext here is that the modification that I made to a piece of code while I was in a K-hole, and I was so impaired that I was not able to read, but I was able to mumble the approximate line of code and substring that needed to be changed to get the code to compile properly. The idea that that could somehow constitute a criminal action that would cement somebody's place in history and they're receiving a $200 million restitution, it's prima facie, it's absolutely insane.
And this was the harshest sentence for a cybercrime in history at that time or something like that?
My primary co-defendant ended up getting the harshest prison sentence at the time, which is about 20 years. But I was maybe one of the first people in American history to end up getting slammed really hard for the digital equivalent of what would have been like driving the getaway car or supplying the silencer to the assassin or whatever you want to call it.
But you wrote the code, right?
I wrote the code. There was admission that I never used the code. And when I say admission, I mean neither the prosecutor alleged it nor did the judge contend it. There was no allegation that I myself ran the code, that I knew where the code would be run, that I knew exactly what the code would be used to do. And there was also no allegation that I had in any way received the profits of the crime, either directly or indirectly. In essence, I was accused of tagging along with my friend and enjoying the fruits of his labor by partying with him. And the prosecutor tried to make some crazy insinuations. I said, I find it very curious that the defendant, Mr. Watt, who has barely a six-figure salary, would be able to do these drugs on a regular basis. And he mentioned some of these things specifically. You have this defendant here, he's doing LSD, and he's doing MDMA, and he's doing ketamine. And I'm in court next to my lawyer, and I'm furiously scribbling down on a piece of paper the exact doses and the prices that I get them down for my drug dealer. And I used to get drugs from the psytrance scene. So I get like dirt cheap, super good drugs from total hippies smuggled out of Israel or wherever the MDMA comes from. And I would be getting liquid LSD for about $5 or $6 a drop. And so maybe I do 10 at a time. So that's like $50. That's like 2 cocktails at an upscale Manhattan lounge. You get your 1,000 mics of LSD for $50. Apparently that's out of range for me as an employee of Morgan Stanley. Or my body weight dosed MDMA, that's $100 a gram. So I'm taking about 280 milligrams at a time. So $28 worth of MDMA is apparently out of my range. And then maybe when I add in the SAM-E to recover the next day, that's like an extra $5.
Wait, let's go back, because I think most people are not going to be familiar with your story. Could you summarize what it was that you were being charged with and what the surrounding crime was that led to all of this?
This is going to be tough to do this concisely, but I'll make my best attempt here. There was a very infamous data breach, and it was the most notorious of its time, although as time passes by, it's sort of overwritten in the popular and historical record by bigger and badder breaches. But at the time, it was sort of like the top thing in the history of online fraud. And there was a number of targets. There was Dave and Buster's and Forever 21, and I think BJ's, but the big one was TJX, which is a parent company of TJ Maxx. And so essentially something around 100 million credit cards were stolen. I think it was like 96 million credit cards were siphoned off from their network over the period of a year or so. And the crime should actually have never been possible at all, because there is something called PCI, and it's like a best practices. It says if there is sensitive financial information being sent over a network, it is supposed to be both encrypted in transit and encrypted at rest. And TJ Maxx apparently was basically sending around their credit cards from the point of sale terminals, both in plain text and storing them in plain text. I was involved in hacking for fun, and this is maybe a little bit difficult for the layperson to understand as a motive, but we really liked humiliating and trolling security professionals. So imagine you have a black hat thing that's always happened, where you have people who posture themselves as the world's greatest security experts, and then the most fun that you can have is to own them and their home computers and their work computers and steal all their research and steal all their email, and like, haha, who's a security expert now, motherfucker?
Right.
And so it's really this power trip / curiosity thing. There's no real financial incentive. Like, sure, like it does end up causing some monetary damage, but not because anybody's being defrauded or anything like that. So that was my world for several years. And my best friend, who happened to be my best friend mostly because we had met so many times in real life, we lived near each other in Florida, and then when we both moved to New York and lived there, and our relationship was primarily social. Like, we knew each other's families, and we'd go out clubbing and sometimes drugs and sometimes dinner and heart-to-heart conversations. In any case, I was sort of burning out on security. I was working at Morgan Stanley full-time. I was also a club promoter at upscale lounges in New York back in the days of Bungalow 8 and all that sort of stuff. And I was also still dabbling a little bit in underground stuff, but it became too much. Between going out on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and sometimes going like festivals on the weekend and doing my day job, like it's too much for all three of those things. So I sort of fell out of security, and my friend was bugging me to create this special piece of software for him. And I remember telling him, like, hey, this isn't particularly sophisticated. Don't you know a bunch of people who will do this for you for money easily? I'm sort of like done with this stuff. And he's like, no, but the thing is, if I ask you to do it, I know it's going to be done properly. And the code is definitely going to work, and it's not going to be detected. And I guess you could maybe call it, I don't know if it's necessarily intentional flattery, but it worked. It made me feel like, okay, like one last hurrah. He wanted me to create a data sniffer. So essentially you would compromise a network, and then you would install this piece of software, and it would siphon off data. So you call that a sniffer. So he wanted me to write this thing, and it's supposed to be undetectable, so it can collect data and silently ship it off somewhere where it can be read later. And he never actually told me what it was for. He gave me these very detailed specs of exactly what it needed to do with the data that it captured, but not where it would be. And my friend was very much into compartmentalization. So if you look at the way a competent terrorist organization works, everybody has a need to know, and people don't necessarily know each other until the last minute. And you have somebody who's making sure that the tasks are being performed in perfect secrecy and ignorance of one another. And there's one person who knows everything and like ties the parts together. And so I was kind of this developer who was writing this highly specialized tool for siphoning data out of a network in a clandestine fashion. And I had a pretty good idea that it was going to be used for something illegal. Now, you could make the argument that it could be used for something innocuous, and theoretically, the tool that I used could be used for something innocuous. Like, there are tools like it that do innocuous things that people use to test security of networks or analyze or debug problems. But look, it's 2025, and I still stand by the fact that I didn't know that it was financial info, and I didn't know that the target was TJ Maxx, but I was pretty sure that it was going to be used for something that was illegal. And so when it came to a plea, I was able to sign my name to that. But in any case, I provided this pivotal piece of software that was not particularly hard to write, and it took me somewhere around like a few hours to write it. So I gave it to him, and I made sure that when I wrote the piece of software, there were no comments, because a lot of times in code, you'll leave these comments saying what a certain thing did, and or maybe like you'll leave a humorous remark. So when I named variable names, I didn't leave any comments. I made it very sterile and antiseptic. You have variable names like N or S, so that somebody analyzing the code would not be able to do some kind of fingerprinting to say, oh, this was made by an English-speaking Russian or somebody from China using a Cyrillic or a Pinyin character set. But anyhow, so I gave him this piece of code, and it was sort of like, thanks very much. And that was the last I heard of it. And then at some point, he needed to modify it slightly to do something else. I guess he found another target network, which I think ended up being Dave & Buster's. So this credit card sniffer that I wrote for TJ Maxx unwittingly apparently was also able to work with minimal modifications on the Dave & Buster's network. And of course, if these places would have been PCI compliant, the code that I would have written would have never worked in the first place, because the credit cards would have been encrypted. And you just see like garbled data instead of Visa, Amex, MasterCard numbers. And so the second time, the time that I modified the code, I was actually high. It's like in a K-hole, partying with my friend in Miami.
Hello, my sweet little bee. I'm Hamilton Morris, your pharmacological advisor, and you can relax. Or can you? You're experiencing reckless caffeination. Tired eyes, jittery hands, nervous perspiration. Regular coffee will do that to you, but mud water with a fraction of the caffeine and 2,250 milligrams of functional mushrooms is leaving me calm, alert, and ready to help you. So put down the cup and pick up the phone. Dial 1-844-FIX-YOUR-FIX to break the cycle of reckless caffeination.
And so I'll tie this back together. In the federal sentencing system, you have points, and it's sort of intuitive. The more points you collect for your crime, the more severe the recommended sentence is. Of course, you have a certain recommended sentence for a first-time offender, and then you have greater recommended sentences for multiple-time offenders. You have a base number of points that you get for the offense. So certain offenses that are less serious have a smaller amount of points. More serious offenses have larger amounts of points, and then you have enhancements. So, for example, the number of affected victims or the extent of the monetary damages will jack this number higher and higher. And so in my case, for example, I got an extra 2 points for use of special skills And I got another 2 points for use of sophisticated means. So you would possibly think, if you're using common sense, you say special skills and sophisticated means, those are kind of the same thing, right? But no, this is how they inflate the points. So imagine that you have berserker strength. I guess that would be a special skill, but it would not be sophisticated means. I'm just trying to envision a scenario where you might get one and not the other, but I got 4 points out of that because 2 points for each. So in any case, the federal points top out at 43 points, and I ended up with 43. If you get more than 43, it gets truncated. So I think I actually got a few over 43, but it got clipped down to 43. For a first-time offender, the recommended sentence is life in prison. And the only way you can get 43 is a base number of points without an enhancement. I think there's only like a few charges. There's terrorism, there's unauthorized use of a nuclear weapon, there's airplane hijacking, there's first-degree premeditated murder, deadly use of a biological weapon. So like those are the only ways that you can hit 43 points without an enhancement. Of course, the major enhancement for me was the amount of damages. And so what they do is they don't actually go out there and say how many dollars worth of fraudulent charges were rung up. They say there were N credit cards, and we are going to multiply all of these against a base number. And in my case, it was $500. So they take these 96 million credit card numbers and they multiply it by 500. And some of them were expired. They don't even subtract the ones that are expired, right? That would have never possibly worked at the time because they were collected, but they were too old. They just take the entire number of credit card numbers that were valid or invalid at some point. They multiply it times 500 and they say, yeah, you stole like billions of dollars. And then the max damage level is some 100 million. So I hit that. So I hit 43 points. And then so you're in court. Basically, if you fight the charges, you have 43 points. And the question is, pretty sure I'm not going to get life in prison. What do I get? It might be 10 years. That would be pretty bad. The government was claiming that I provided something to further a conspiracy. So conspiracy charges are pretty vague. It means that you can do something that is not overtly criminal, but if you provide it in furtherance of a criminal enterprise, even if you have a sort of vague idea that what you're doing may be used to abet a criminal action, you're on the hook for conspiracy. So the first element of that is very obvious, which is I provided this sniffer. So they said provided assistance to an ongoing criminal enterprise. And then they said, and he continued to provide assistance to extend and augment this technology to meet the ongoing needs of the conspiracy. And so that part right there, which I don't know that I remember it quite verbatim after almost 20 years, but it's essentially something like that. That's where the ketamine comes into play, because I dashed out the sniffer very quickly over the course of some hours. And then some months later, we're in Miami in the penthouse of the Lowe's Hotel, and I'm in a K-hole. And I guess my buddy Albert, for some reason, seems to think, oh, actually, no. I was about to say for some reason, he thinks that's the right time to ask me how to fix the code. But I know why he asked me, because he was nagging me to do this for a while. And I just wanted to party, and he realized that when I'm on a bunch of drugs, I'm pliant, and I wasn't going to like say not now. And I tend to be pretty agreeable and passive on ketamine. I don't know this for sure, but I imagine Steven's going to tell me he's too busy now. So let's get him to modify the code. And so he asked me to do this, and I sat down at the computer. And one of the things that happens on ketamine when you're not quite in a K-hole, but you're pretty fucked up, you become completely dyslexic. Your capacity to recognize numbers or letters completely melts away. You remain cognizant or understanding of verbal dialogue passively the longest. You lose your ability to speak, but before any of that, you lose the ability to spell. You lose the ability to perform basic math. It kind of reverts you to this animalistic or primal state. And so I was messed up to the point when I sat down, he handed me the laptop, and I looked at it, and I'm like, I like, I can't do this. And keep in mind that I'm using one of these like consoles, right? This isn't like point and click with a mouse where you can scroll and select text. You're typing commands like special letter sequences to delete lines and paste them. And it's a little more involved. If you are fucked up and you are using Microsoft Word, it would be a lot easier than using a text-based editor like Vim is what it's called. And so we had another buddy there, and my friend's not a programmer, but our mutual friend there was a programmer. And I was like, dude, I can't read this, but I was like, read me the error message from the compiler. And so they said, okay, yeah, this is what it's saying. Such and such definition cannot be found. And so I'm like, okay, I know what this is. There is a define. I think it's going to be in the first 20 lines of the code. And there's going to be a variable, and there's going to be, I don't remember what the variable's called, but there's a value, and I think it's probably going to be around 2000, and you're going to need to change that so that the first digit is one higher. It's hard to explain. I wouldn't even be able to tell you what 2 + 1 is, but I would be able to know that the number is 2 and it needs to be one higher. That's what ketamine does to your brain, right? And so I provided this assistance, and they corrected the compiler error. And because I directed somebody to make a one-line change, like very unsophisticated stuff, like somebody looking at the code for the first time that knows what they're doing could have solved the problem that I did in far less time than I, the programmer, could have on a large bump of ketamine. But in any case, that was one of the things that they used to pin me down. This allegation that while under the use of ketamine, I furthered the needs of a conspiracy in a very technologically sophisticated manner. I don't remember exactly what I sent to you in that letter, but it was something like, hey, look at this. Can you please tell me that you call instant bullshit on the idea that I did something technologically nefarious when I was so high I couldn't even remember the alphabet.
The claim was that the ketamine had enhanced your coding abilities?
That was not a claim made by the court. I think that was something that sort of came out subsequently in the media by reporters who don't know MDMA from Adam. Excuse my drug pun.
So the added charge here was not that it increased the sophistication of the crime. It was,
to be correct here, it was not so much an added charge. It was part of my plea agreement. The plea agreement that I had to sign my name to was that I acted in furtherance of the conspiracy, and then I continued to aid the conspiracy after that point by providing this assistance. It's hard to draw a direct line between the language of that plea and the sentence that I received. But what I can tell you with almost certainty is that had I decided to take that to court, that is clearly the argument that would have presented to the jury, right? They would have said something to the effect of, not only did he do this once, but he even did it again, and he changed the code to work on different targets. So it's sort of an inductive argument that establishes criminality and criminal intent. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And there was also, am I misremembering this, the buffet chain Boston Market? Weren't they involved in some way as well? Or was that, am I just totally imagining that?
Boston Market? I think maybe. There's so many targets, and these are places I never even shop at or ate at. It was really crazy to see the list of stuff that it was allegedly like involved in.
And so your friend is using this program to steal credit card information.
No, the conspiracy used a number of exploits or criminal means to pilfer data from the various targets. But specifically, my sniffer was used for the big boy, which was TJ Maxx. And then the second target was Dave & Buster's. And I remember when I heard about Dave & Buster's, I'd never heard of Dave & Buster's. It sounded like, I don't know, like a topless bar where you can ride a mechanical bull. Like I was in my mid-20s doing ketamine on the weekends. I don't have kids. I don't associate with kids. I don't have young relatives that live in the US. I didn't know it was like Chuck E. Cheese. I've never even been to a Chuck E. Cheese in my own childhood. So I got hit with this charge of helping rip off Dave and Buster's while on ketamine, and I didn't even know what the fuck Dave and Buster's was. And I couldn't even look it up because I didn't have access to a computer. So my lawyer had to tell me, I guess he had a kid or something. He's like, yeah, Dave and Buster's, like, whatever.
Okay. This is pretty wild. And I know that there's a lot. I don't know if it's worth getting into.
No, I'm here. I hope I'm not like, rambling. I'm trying to give you like amazing. Sort of like, okay, good. Yeah, I could talk about this far longer than I think that like we'll just both end up exhausted here if you don't stop me.
A few interesting ramifications. Sure. One, I recall that it made you a anti-snitching crusader. Yes, I don't know if that's like an aspect of all of this you want to.
You mean like a chemically induced aspect, or you mean my experience?
Yeah, your experience.
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. So, okay. I never really had particularly strong feelings on snitching. So prior to this incident, I had exactly one run-in with federal law enforcement. I had a really good friend when I was about from 16 to 18, and his name was Jerome Heckenkamp. And he went by the alias of Skate, SK8. And we were sort of kindred spirits. I was an outlier in the computer underground. I would never talk about quote unquote hacking unless I were busted. And even today, I just want to call it the H word because it's so fucking cringe for me to talk about this stuff to civilians and people that know nothing about it and were never involved in about it and don't know the first, like they couldn't hack their way out of a wet paper bag. So like there's like this code of omerta or whatever, like among people like my friends and people that I would consider real black hats, right? You just don't talk about it. And what's changed for me is my case has gotten so much publicity, and I'm also trying to use it to some end of good, which has nothing to do with my personal rehabilitation or reform and has everything to do with my conviction. No pun intended, my conviction to ameliorate the state of the criminal justice system, both in the sentencing and correctional aspect. But I digress here. My only run-in with federal LE law enforcement prior to this point was my buddy Skate. So I was an outlier because I was like a super academic, a super achiever, and a digital miscreant. And this is rare because a lot of people that do what I do, they have pretty lax parental control and they get bored with school just like I did. And they don't worry about paddings or college resume and stuff like that. And I was the opposite. I was National Honor Society, played 8 sports, musical instrument, got about almost a 1,500 on my SAT, which is not incredible, good enough for an Ivy League usually, right? I skipped a grade. I graduated at the age of 16. I was a national AP scholar. I started college at 17 with like over a year full of credits. I ended up graduating from college with my degree at 19. Started off in computer science and I got super bored of it. And I ended up with a degree in philosophy, which was a lot more interesting. But what I'm saying is it's a weird path. Like it's a common path for maybe your traditional academic overachiever kid, but it's not usual at all for people that commit computer crimes. And my buddy was even more extreme form of overachiever. So he graduated from college at 16, but he was homeschooled. So I think his trajectory may have been perhaps artificially greased by that. Like I could have maybe like chopped off another year or two if like my parents were grading me, not to cast aspersions on his achievement because he's a fucking super smart kid. But anyhow, he ended up with his master's degree by 19 as opposed to like my undergraduate degree at 19, and he was working at Los Alamos National Labs. And there was this guy who did these defacements, and defacements was back when like somebody used to change like a web page, like say you deface like whitehouse.gov, and basically like put the equivalent of digital graffiti on
or
there.
The DEA or DARE website, right?
Sure. Yeah. But it was considered lame. It was for the most part, it's considered super lame because the idea is, if you're like a real operator and you access a place like that, you're going to lie in stealth and you're just going to like transfer all their data out and just archive their lives, right? And sit on it. And then you're going to use the information that you find in that place to break into other sites. It's kind of weird. There's no real end game except owning the entire planet. For a lot of black hats that I knew, it was just like, you go into sites, you backdoor them, you sniff the passwords that people on that computer use to log into other computers. Then you log into those computers using their accounts. You root those computers, you backdoor those computers, and it's like there's no end. There's a lot of computers on the internet, and eventually if you just hack everything like one hop to the next, you end up with some really crazy shit. So generally you don't deface something because that gives up the game right away, right? It's sort of like saying, haha, I'm here, and now they're just going to come in and delete everything and reinstall it and upgrade all the software. So I think this guy went by alias of Magic Effects. Like, he hacked eBay and Juniper and a couple of really big places, and I think he defaced at least one of them. So this kid who went by Skate in our circles, he was arrested as Magic Effects, and he had this long court battle and ended up going to prison. But during the investigation, I remember some FBI agents came to my house, and this was in my senior year of high school, and my dad was there, and they wanted to talk to me, and they sat me down in the living room in front of my dad, and they're like, yeah, do you know this person, Skate Jerome Heckenkamp? And I'm like, yeah, I know him really well. He's a super nice kid. He's actually very Christian. Like, we couldn't even induce him to swear. That's actually probably even weirder than everything. He never swore once. He is just the most wholesome imaginable kid that, you know, the most wholesome kid you could conceive of. And so they just keep asking me these questions. Did you know that he was Magic Effects? And I'm like, no. And you kind of think that almost ends there, but law enforcement kind of thinks that, like, yeah, if they ask you the same question 10 different ways and change an adverb or change from the active to the passive voice, they're going to Jedi mind trick you until stumbling and confessing something. Right. And it was just, I don't know, it was 1D checkers, which I guess is just like a point on a piece of paper where nothing moves, right? So I think they, quote unquote, interrogated me politely for like 15 minutes and then got up, whatever, and left with their crew cuts and their fucking Oldsmobile or whatever G-men drive around in back in 1999. And I remember my dad was super proud because he was there for the whole time, and he didn't say anything, but I found out later that he was super proud that I just sat there and stonewalled the fuck out of them. And I don't think my dad cared at all if my friend did anything illegal. He was just he was just very happy with the way I just shut down the situation. And we didn't really even talk about it that much afterwards. I sort of found out secondhand that my dad was proud of me by some comment that was made to me, maybe by like my mother or like a family friend. So that was when the idea first sort of came into my mind. Now, when I was partying a little bit more heavy with my buddy prior to his arrest, because he got arrested first, I remember thinking, with the amount of money that we were spending, I had honestly no idea exactly where the money was coming from, but I was just along for the ride. And I guess the best way I could describe it was I was like a mafia wife. I didn't ask questions, and he paid for my sushi, and I slept in the guest bedroom, and we did drugs together, and he gave me the money to buy the drugs because I always knew where to get the best, purest drugs, and that was sort of like my task. That was my overtly ongoing criminal contribution to the conspiracy, was to actually provide large amounts of recreational drugs that probably could have gotten us arrested for distribution, except for the fact that it was enough drugs to keep us rocked out of our mind, like a few of us, for 3 days straight, right? But like probably somewhere somebody would have gone to prison for 20 years for possessing a pharmacopoeia that large, right? So at a certain point, after a couple years of this, it's entered my mind, I'm not really doing anything overtly illegal except for doing lots of drugs and hanging around with, and occasionally getting a free meal off of somebody who's definitely getting their money from an illicit income source. And I started thinking about it a little bit, like, hey, something might come down the pipe, but I've been pretty careful not to do anything overtly illegal myself other than consume drugs. But there may be a time that I get burnt or touched by this in some sort of fashion. And I chewed on it a little bit every now and then because it just seemed like we were having so much fun and we were so out of our minds. There was something in the back of my consciousness or psyche saying this can't last forever. I didn't feel like somebody would die. It was just like the fun just cannot possibly last this long. And so I got this sort of idea, if anything happens, I'm just going to fucking shut the fuck up and not say anything until I contact a lawyer. Anyhow, my buddy ends up being the first to be sort of suddenly busted. He ends up getting raided a couple months before I do. So by the time I end up getting raided,
you knew that he'd been raided.
Yeah. I knew the day that it happened. His girlfriend that he was with in Miami ended up stranded because they arrested him at his hotel suite. I had to end up FedExing her money so that she could fly home and all that sort of stuff. So I knew from the beginning. And it gave me a couple months to clean up. I didn't really have anything to hide, but at the same time, I just dotted my I's and crossed my T's and formatted my hard drives and formatted all my media, even though there wasn't anything there. There was actually stuff that may have been illegal, but not tied to for-profit criminality involving my friend.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, I had months to do this. So I was just sitting around wondering, when is it going to happen? Because he gets busted and then another mutual friend gets busted and another one. And it's like, okay, it's coming around to me. So I had a lot of time to mull this over in my mind and think, okay, well, there's only one plan to choose from, and it's pretty easy. And it's called shut up and give me my lawyer. And when they come in to talk to me, I'll say biographical information only. You can ask me about my name, my date of birth, my physical residence address, where I work, how tall am I, what's my hair color, my eye color, how much do I weigh, what size are my feet, what's my inseam. I'll answer all this stuff, but nothing more. I'll tell you my mom's name and her birthday. I'll tell you my pet's name and whether it's spayed or not, but I'm not going to give up anything meaningful. And so it was just sort of like, you have a really simple plan that you know you're going to stick to if the worst comes to happen. And I just found it exceedingly easy to abide by that.
This podcast is also brought to you by Lucy Nicotine, a company that makes nicotine pouches, nicotine gum, and nicotine lozenges. I particularly enjoy the apple ice flavored nicotine pouch. It is a refreshing and well-formulated product. If you don't already use nicotine products, I recommend you don't begin. They're habit forming. But if you do, I think this is the finest nicotine product on the market. Thank you, Lucy. And in case this isn't already obvious, warning, this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical.
I'm just really good at following orders, whether those orders are issued by somebody else, like a boss, or whether they're orders issued by me to myself in this case, as a subvocal code of conduct that's rattling around my head for several weeks. And I gave up nothing. And they came through the apartment here. It was funny, like when they raided me, you're sitting in my apartment right now, so you see the size of this place, right? You came up the elevator, right? So when I came up the day that I got raided, I was just getting back from leg day. Like I'd been doing squats and lunges and I was actually having trouble walking. And I remember as I'm getting out of the elevator, I actually dropped my keys as the elevator is opening up on my floor. And as I bend over to pick up my keys and the door opens simultaneously, somebody knocks me down on the ground with a riot shield. And I look up and there's probably about, 6 people, all sort of SWAT. I mean, it's not a SWAT team because it's a Secret Service response team. Again, I don't know what the proper terminology is, but they look like they're in anti-riot gear. They've got a battering ram that they don't use because they push me down and then they cuff me and then they go through my pockets and then they take the keys out and they open the front door there, and you can tell one of them's disappointed that he doesn't get to knock down my door with the battering ram. Like I think I sort of saw that forlorn look in his eyes for a second. And so, yeah, they sit me down at my dinner table on one of the chairs, which is sort of near the door. So I basically have a bird's eye view to them going through the apartment and going through all my stuff. And I'd say probably something like 14 or 15 agents pass through here at some point. One of them goes into the hallway into the trash area. And I remember one of them comes back really excited because he goes into the recycling and he picks up the cardboard bin and there's a bunch of shredded paper in there. And he's like, oh, look what I found. This is interesting. And I know what it is. It's my shredded paper. Every time I get a piece of junk mail, which you got a lot more back in 2008 than you do in 2025. But every time I get a piece of mail or a credit card offer that has my name and my address in it, I shred it. And then eventually the paper shredder fills up, and then I put it in the recycling bin like a good eco-conscious New Yorker that I am, Manhattanite. And it was very obvious that they thought that some sort of evidence of crime was in there, and they were going to send it to the lab, and some neurodivergent person was going to reassemble it, and they'd crack the fucking case or something. And I'm just sort of sitting there stone-faced. And they went through my stuff. They're actually pretty respectful. There was some stuff that I thought was more sinister than it turned out to be, because I learned a little bit about the raid years after. So for example, there was a woman that came to the apartment, and she was half Croatian. And one of the first things they said to me is, are you going to need a translator? And I'm like, what? They're like, do you prefer to speak in English or Serbo-Croatian? And I'm like, because I do speak the language fluently because my mother's born in Yugoslavia. So I'm like, yeah, no. Well, first of all, I don't need to talk to anybody. But if I do, I don't need to talk to her in a non-English language. Although afterwards, I changed my mind, and I'm not one for small talk. You're not going to catch me talking about the Lakers, most of whom are shorter than me. So I'm not even going to fabricate a story. So I started talking to her just about bullshit, and you could see like ears kind of pricking up as I'm just asking her, what's your name and where were you born? And how long have you been with the Secret Service? And all this shit I would never talk to anybody in a million years. Just like casual conversation in Serbo-Croatian, just to make everybody uncomfortable. I had this thought that they had made a really lame attempt to social engineer me because she was young and semi-attractive. And I'm thinking to myself, is this like the best you got? Later, I found out that they thought that my ex-wife might be there with me, and she was a Croatian national at the time. So I guess they brought somebody to possibly talk to her, although she's perfectly bilingual herself. These are these sorts of things where you ascribe more malice or forethought or premeditation to a sort of standard bureaucratic practice, right? Like it seems sinister when you don't have all the facts, but it ends up being like a little bit more mundane of an explanation. They go through all my stuff, and they're actually surprisingly respectful. I think I said explicitly to everybody in my apartment, look, I realize that you have a warrant. They showed me the search warrant. And I'm like, you have a warrant. You're obviously entitled to go through everything that I own. I have a decent place. You see that I'm clean and organized. I'd appreciate it if you don't break a bunch of stuff or leave everything looking like a chaotic mess. And I don't need to invite you to help yourselves because the law is telling you to do that. But please, just don't trash my house. I'd really appreciate it. And at least one person was like, yeah, no, we get it. You do have a nice place, and it's nice to search through somebody's house. It's not a pigsty. And so to their credit, they were pretty cool about it. It's sort of funny to watch them go around because my coffee table at the time had this revolving side hinge that you could slide it out. Like you couldn't really tell that there's a compartment in there because it swings out almost like a lazy Susan. Mm-hmm. And I remember the gleam in the eye, like, oh, we found like a secret compartment. It's just like a bunch of playing cards and coasters so that people don't damage the coffee table doing drugs or drinking gin and tonics on it. And that went on for a while. So to be clear, I was sort of like a software expert, but I've never really been into computer hardware. So this is back in the time that I had a desktop computer. Was like, I don't even know if I had a laptop that was on. I think my working computers were all desktops, and one of them was powered on. And of course, this was a computer, like I said, I had actually formatted it and secure wiped the contents of the hard drive weeks ago. So it was a blank install of Windows, which is an operating system I never used. It's like Windows XP default install with nothing on the desktop, and the password is password 123 or something ridiculous like that. So they break in here and they see that the computer's on, and they're not going to sit here and try to crack the password, but they need to exfiltrate the computer out so that they can take it to their lab and do whatever the fuck they do in these sorts of situations. So they have some kind of hardware device that they wheel in on a trolley, and it's some sort of device that basically allows you to keep continuous AC power flow to the power supply of the chassis, so that you can essentially keep the power going, so that when you plug the AC adapter out of the wall, the computer just doesn't power off. Because their idea is, if there's something on the hard drive, right, that's pretty easy. You can power down the computer and then you can just read the hard drive with relatively unsophisticated means. But imagine that there's something sensitive in memory. Imagine that I have some sort of criminal chat open that's not being logged, but it's on the screen. So the contents of that chat, say it was some kind of plot, it would be in RAM, in memory. So the moment the computer loses power, the contents of random access memory, they're volatile. Without power, they're lost immediately, right? That's why RAM is so fast compared to a hard drive, like a spinning platter. And so their idea is, we need to capture, for forensic purposes, this live computer, and then they probably have some instrument to inspect like the flash memory contents. And this is sort of beyond my knowledge of hardware-based forensics. They think they're like super clever. Aha, we're bringing in this specialized, I don't know, $20,000, $30,000 piece of machinery, and it takes them 2 hours to set this thing up and wheel the computer out. And I know there's absolutely nothing on it. And I also left a large encrypted file with, I don't even know if I remembered the password, because I created a large file, like a few gigabytes, and then I encrypted it, and there's nothing in it. And it was on that computer. And so I knew that, again, they're going to send that to the lab, and they're going to spend a very long time trying to get into that file.
This is done just to fuck with people.
Just to fuck with them. Yeah.
Because you knew they were coming and you wanted to fuck with them.
I just wanted to waste their time. I wanted to waste taxpayers' money. Like, unfortunately, the investigation couldn't possibly cost as much as $171.5 million. So like, there's no way I came up on top, but like I'm sure that at least, several $100,000 were like wasted trying to, piece together this worthless computer. So this is sort of what I did. I don't know if you'd really call this like malicious tactics. I'd say it's part of the game. Like, if you're going to come in here, and like, they showed up at my work the next day and raided me there, even though my work has always been sacrosanct. Like, I've never ever done anything remotely illegal from work, because like, it's always just sort of been like that red line. So they showed up there the following morning after they raided me, and that was really a pretty humiliating process. They were waiting for me, and most of my colleagues were already there, and you walk into the office and I see the faces of my colleagues before I realize that the Secret Service people are on the wings there. And then I'm like this super tall, conspicuous dude, and they just come and say hi to me. And I just turn around and start walking back towards the hallway. Funny enough, my office at the time was in the Woolworth building. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I think I am, yeah.
Yeah, it's this historic building in downtown Manhattan, right across from City Hall. And funny enough, I worked maybe 3 floors above where the Manhattan Project started, which is actually how it got its name, because it started as a scientific project actually in Manhattan prior to the whole thing migrating out to Los Alamos. But that's not even the weird thing. The pretrial office, the pretrial and post-trials and drug testing offices for the Southern District of New York, which is where I had to report regularly for my urinalysis, was in the exact same building where I used to work. And the elevator bank that you use to get to the court services are adjacent to the elevator bank that I was using for the last year to get to work. So after I get arrested, I end up needing to basically stand 10 feet away from where I would normally go to work, and I'd be getting there at the same time as my former coworkers were. They'd be going back up to work after I had been raided at work and fired. And so I'd be going to piss into a cup and they'd be going back to work. And we would see each other waiting for different elevators that were next to each other. That was a surreal experience. And I did that for the better part of a year. And then when I got out of prison, my post-trial supervision was in the same office. So I ended up going back 2 years after prison and seeing coworkers again. And you'd like to think that somebody was like, hey man, are you all right? I heard what happened to you. But no, it was just sort of like you exchange an awkward glance and you go on with your respective lives. But I was going to mention one thing about this raid that I forgot, and this was really the turning point for me. So as you can imagine, they go through everything. They seize everything that's like remotely electronic. They seize everything that looks like it could possibly store data, like a hard drive or a flash drive or a digital camera or a USB key. I don't even remember how prevalent USB keys were back then, but they were around. So anything that looks like it might have electronic media on it, they take anything that looks like a notebook or something that there might be like human scribbling in. And then they load it all up into boxes and then they itemize it, right? Like they give you an inventory of everything that they're seizing. And then you sign the paper. So that's their little chain of custody forensic thing. And I remember towards the end of the search, they're going through that console right there. And that mostly has a bunch of audio CDs. I actually even had some VHS tapes. I had some DVDs. I think this is like even pre-Blu-ray for me, but I had audio CDs and I had DVDs. Just some random stuff, like at a underground breakboy dancing competition on VHS. But anyhow, one of the tapes that they seize, there's one thing that they take of extreme personal value to me, right? And so my dad had passed away from cancer maybe about 2 years before this happened. And I would say that at least to some small extent, some of my wildness in partying was exacerbated by this kind of grief that I didn't fully deal with in a sort of healthy way. And let there be no confusion. I'm not at all saying that any of what I did was the result of grief over my father. It's just sort of like I went probably a little bit hard on drugs and partying because it's been known to help you forget these things, you know? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I did prior to my dad's death was we did a videotape interview of him, and it was probably about 2 hours long, and it consisted of me holding a camcorder up and asking my dad questions about him, his childhood, and his family history, all these things that weren't really like recorded anywhere, that it would just be oral history that only he would know. Mm-hmm. And I recorded that interview for obvious reasons, for posterity, for myself. So when they took this cassette, this like micro cassette out, and I said, hey, you know, I see here on the inventory, you have something that says assorted media. And I'm like, that's fine. Most of this stuff I don't care about, but you have one micro cassette there. And I told him exactly what it was. And I said, I would really like to ask you as a favor, can you please itemize that specifically? I'm fine signing off on this list. Can you please just itemize this one thing separately, because it's extremely important for me that I be able to get that back once you're done analyzing and copying all that stuff. And the lead Secret Service agent, his name was Pete Gannon, his response to me was, sorry, we don't have time for that. Oh. And I said to him, really? Is that really your answer? And he's like, we got to go. And at that moment, I crossed this sort of Rubicon from casual contempt, like, hey, we're both playing this game. You're the cat, I'm the mouse. You get to raid me, but I also get to be smug and rub my juvenile intelligence in your face and make you rage a little bit. But his refusal to give me the itemization of this extraordinarily, like, it's the most important thing that I owned. And this motherfucker looked me in the eye and twice denied itemizing it so that I could get it back later. And a switch flipped in my mind. It's not like I hatched some sort of plot or revenge, because that never happened. But it was just pure, undying contempt for this man as an individual. And I think at that point, I consciously thought of myself as a scofflaw, I mean, in the literal sense of that word. Somebody who scoffs at the law. Because I follow the law, right? I mean, look where the Secret Service is. They've been riddled with so many scandals, whether it's fucking prostitutes in Colombia on Obama's detail.
Right,
I don't know
right.
you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Like, I've never cheated on a girlfriend or my wife in my life, you know? So it's like, well, I know the rules of the game, and you think that you have moral rectitude. You're basically a warm body to block a bullet hitting a president, right? But there was something inside me that's like, you know, whatever value that you think you have, I will exhibit that tenfold against your interests. And so it really cemented my decision never to cooperate with them in any kind of fashion. It was done. From the moment they didn't itemize that cassette and they left my apartment, there's nothing in the world that could have enticed me to cooperate with them. I wouldn't work with them to reduce my sentence. I even had issues taking a plea because I was so anti-snitching by the time that my case started rolling through the court system. It was already decided that I would never cooperate against any of my court defendants. But I got a little bit perturbed by the idea of engaging in, I mean, there's no terminology for this. This is just like my internal monologue. This notion of soft snitching, which is like by signing your name on a paper that says, I admit that I was part of a criminal conspiracy. Even that, even though I didn't say that anybody else did anything illegal, the fact that I even admitted that there was somebody that did something illegal, that even bothered me. Does that make sense?
Of course.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You gave me a little bit of a quizzical look. So I was like, yeah.
Wow. Just got to the top of a 511B, not trying to brag. I think I did it with the help of this matcha-infused electrolyte beverage, Matcha Aid. Not something that immediately would sound appealing. I will admit, when I was first told about Matcha Aid, I thought the combination of matcha green tea and electrolytes sounded slightly disgusting. And then I drank a whole box. And then I drank another. Maybe you feel that we've reached peak matcha. Maybe you're tired of matcha. Maybe you think the matcha latte has gone too far. I personally, I'm okay with it. I think we can go deeper. And now I'm a convert. I'm a big fan of Matcha Aid, as strange as it may sound. I would demonstrate by pouring it at the top of this wall, but I'm afraid that I would drop a bottle and give somebody a traumatic brain injury. Matcha.com was created by psychedelic pioneer Dr. Andrew Weil. They are a premier source of Japanese imported, heavy metal tested, delicious matcha. I use it when I'm climbing. I use it when I'm doing sporty things. I use it when I'm dangling 45 feet off the ground doing a podcast advertisement, offering you a discount code if you use Hamilton at matcha.com. Matcha.com. Matcha.com.
So I eventually decided that that was a step too far. I decided that it was acceptable to take this plea, and we got it down so that I was able to get anywhere between 0 and 5 years. So my 43 points that theoretically meant life in prison as a first-time offender, I was capped at a maximum of 5 years incarceration, and the judge ended up splitting the difference, right? And the words that she used to me in court, there's a notion of general deterrence and specific deterrence. Specific deterrence is a very easy concept. It's like, what punishment do I give you, the defendant, to ensure that once you have satisfied this sentence, you will be de-incentivized from recidivism, right? And general deterrence is a little bit different. And that's basically says that for onlookers and spectators and other people who might dare dream of doing the same thing that you did, what is an appropriate punishment that would deter someone else from following in your footsteps? And the judge said, she took into account, like, you know, my family history and my lack of crime and my good standing as an employee and a taxpayer and all that, and having, like, you know, healthy relationship with my wife and my mom and all that stuff. He said, look, I believe that specific deterrence has been satisfied. I see no reason why you would ever commit an offense after getting out of prison. But in order to satisfy general deterrence, because this is a very big case and There's a lot of money lost. And also my co-defendant, which I did not mention, he was actually working as a Secret Service informant while committing these crimes. So there was a lot of egg on law enforcement's face. I think there's like
a Secret Service informant?
Yeah. So he was
on something unrelated?
Well, a similar type of crime. So essentially he was busted. And this is, like I said before, like this is such an insanely long story. I'm trying to like thread the needle here. Yeah. But he was busted a while ago and ended up, and he was an informant. And back when, and I knew this, and when we were partying and doing all this stuff, he was being paid by the Secret Service, but he was also continuing to commit crime. So he was making $75,000 a year in cash, tax-free, which is actually not a tiny amount of money when you consider that this is Miami and he's living at his parents' house and like netting $75,000 a year in 2007.
To provide them with information on the hacker community?
Yeah, we didn't really talk about this stuff much, but I think they had a lot of international targets. The hotbed for a lot of this stuff is the former stands, or it could be Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Romania. There's a lot of people doing this sort of stuff in these countries where there's no extradition laws and the countries don't care anyhow. Right. So I think he was providing information like that. So in terms of law enforcement and the prosecution's desire to nail me to the cross or whatever, they were very, very angry about the notion of this happening from an informant, and also very angry that nobody was cooperating. And I think that you recall that my prosecutor was the one who prosecuted Aaron Schwartz.
Right.
His name was Stephen Hyman. So my prosecutor, he was so aggressive that two other defendants, one related to my case, one not related, because Aaron Schwartz is, of course, one of the original founders of Reddit, who was like busted for siphoning off academic journal PDFs. Both of them killed themselves because the prosecution was so aggressive. You had my prosecutor saying things like, I'd already taken the plea, so he knew that he couldn't ask for more than 5 years. But his argument to the judge was, even if we give him the maximum sentence, I see no reason why he would not come out ready to do the exact same thing again, because he's expressed no remorse. And he really tried hard to paint me as a sociopath. And the Occam's razor sort of explanation for this whole thing was like, yeah, and it's the truth. It's what I've been saying consistently for 20 years is I did something as a favor for a friend. I was naive in terms of my understanding of how broadly a conspiracy charge could be applied in the American criminal justice system, how even if you're very careful not to commit a crime yourself, you can still get fried for helping somebody do something. And I did it because of the thrill of knowing that I could write this piece of code that might be a crime, even if I weren't involved with it. And there was this flattery of feeling that anybody could have written it, but I was asked to provide the most bulletproof version of it possible. But at the end of the day, it was really just a favor. And my friend had to nag me about it because I was so busy between work and partying that I couldn't really find the time. And I think that's one of the things that he sort of did. And it's not nefarious. I like doing drugs with him, but also because he treated me to a good time, I also felt compelled, like, okay, I'm going to sit down one weekend and knock out this sniffer, right? Because we do things for each other. Like my friend, for example, Albert, when I moved from Astoria to Manhattan, and he wasn't even in New York at the time because I don't know how to drive a truck, he flew up at a moment's notice and rented a U-Haul and helped me move all my stuff. He has like hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. He could have just thrown money at the problem and said like, hey, I'm hiring a crew to come over. No, he came up and helped me load all my stuff and helped me unload all my stuff. So we had a very traditional kind of close friendship at the bottom of it. And we were two completely different kind of criminals. And of course, that sort of distinction is easily lost. Like my judge was very baffled at the idea that somebody could possibly involve themselves in a crime like this without any expectation of remuneration. And my sentencing actually had to be adjourned because what it seemed like had happened was I don't think the judge really read through the casework much before we showed up for our sentencing day in court. I think all of these federal judges are jaded to a certain degree, and they think that after they've been on the bench for a few years, they've kind of seen it all, and they have expectations of what motives are and some sort of expectation of guilt. Especially me, I had already pleaded guilty, right? So the judge probably doesn't approach this sort of scenario with a very open mind, right? She's perhaps thinking, I'm going to plead mitigating circumstances. I was poor. I was an orphan. My kids were starving. I was trying to impress a girl, whatever. Yes, I was a hacker. I was an H-word person, and I had a career, quote unquote, doing this, but it wasn't for money. It was for the lulz and like the power and the knowledge, some kind of trifecta of those things. She just did not understand this at all. And she ordered me, she said, I'm adjourning the sentencing right now because prosecutor Stephen Hyman was accusing me very nakedly of being a sociopath. And I'm adjourning this right now because, like, I'm not really sure I understand the motive here, and I would strongly recommend that the defendant receive a psychiatric evaluation in the interim, and I recommend that he does that, and we will adjourn at a future date. And so I had to spend a day in Braintree, Massachusetts, filling out this Minnesota personality. Jesus, I don't even remember the acronym. You know, I'm not a licensed psychologist, but imagine filling out like scantrons for 3 hours, and they're asking you 80 different ways to figure out if you're like dissembling or lying. Are people out to get you? Do you hear voices in your head? And some of these questions start to be really weird when you have a high profile case, right? Like when they say, do you think people are out to get you? Well, Jesus fucking Christ, I was surveilled by a Secret Service team. And I know for a fact, like I read the court papers about how they were monitoring me, and then they descended upon my apartment with semi-automatic weapons and a fucking riot shield and a battering ram. And are people watching me or following me? Like, what's the fucking answer to that question? It's a Scantron. I can't fill in the blank, right? I can't write in qualified explanation. So I'm like, Jesus, I'm kind of sweating a little bit. And then you have things like, I believe that like people recognize me, or something like, you know, I believe that I'm a famous media personality. And okay, like, how do I answer this? Do people recognize me? I'm 7 feet tall. It's, you know, it's like this weird biographical detail, but again, I'm filling out the loony bin Scantron test, and it's like, yeah, like wherever I go, people do kind of like remember me and recognize me, and like
you turn heads when you walk down the street.
Yeah,
I've seen it myself.
Yeah, and I have to block that out or I'll go crazy. I don't notice it. I've filtered that out from a very young age because I'm a misanthrope to my core, and the people that approach me about my height approach me for the dumbest shit. You know, how's the weather up there? Do you play basketball? I've had people get really angry when I tell them I don't play basketball. Somebody told me you're a waste of life. So then these questions, you know, like, I think like they're trying to sniff out like megalomania on the Scantron, the Looneytron. And so like they're asking some things about, are you a celebrity personage? Or I don't remember what the exact verbiage was, but I'm also getting letters from Rolling Stone reporters and Dateline or whoever the fuck contacted me that I rejected or spoke to. And it's sort of like, well, you know, like, I don't know, man. Like, I'm kind of like being followed, and like people everywhere recognize me and they want to talk to me, and they probably want to read my thoughts because I've definitely been wiretapped and bugged and all this sort of stuff. So anyhow, allegedly, I aced the Scantron because I answered it as truthfully as I could. And then I had like an examination with this guy. So I'm assuming like Simpsons is kind of like a popular pop cultural reference point that most people get. Like my psych, I mean, I don't know if he's alive today, God bless him, but he looked and talked exactly like Hans Moleman from The Simpsons. And so this guy is like, imagine all this stuff that I'm telling you right now about hacking for, you know, steal credit cards versus like hacking to fuck with like white hats and like internet relay chat and like, you know, it was so, you know, he seemed to hold it together. I think he understood me because I read the report afterwards and it seemed I did not disagree with anything he said, but it was weird at the time. And I think he got a little bit more of a weird story than he expected, even for his, because like I'm like a pretty stable, smart guy, to use my own version of that turn of phrase.
Yes.
But like the circumstances around, like my identifying circumstances are pretty weird. Like my childhood was pretty weird in a relatively innocuous and non-traumatic way. Things about my person and my personal history, they're weird. So I'm like a very rational, left-brained, hyper-logical, analytical person, but like, an image of me, a snapshot of me is pretty weird looking. So he pronounces me sane, and he says that it seems I've suffered from chronic dysthymia for my entire life, which seems like a pretty accurate assessment. I'd never even considered it before, but yeah, I guess I'm kind of like a seasoned pessimist, and true happiness is sort of like one of those things that doesn't happen often unless I swallowed some Molly 30 minutes earlier. And I say that like that's back when Molly was actually Molly. It wasn't mixed with amphetamine or whatever weird stuff. It wasn't pressed into a pill. It was just like a beautiful sort of translucent crystal shard that was inserted into somebody's asshole in a Tel Aviv airport, and then like made its way to New York, where somebody extracted it and crushed it up and put it into bags. But I digress again. So he gives a report, and then the prosecutor, Stephen Hyman, he makes a mockery out of this. He tries to hone his whole sociopath thing, right? It's his argument about me just being completely amoral. It kind of shifts as he's trying to respond to this report, but he adds some new embellishments on it. So one of the things he says is like, he makes sure to stress that this isn't a crime of necessity. He said, this is somebody who grew up in a comfortable upper middle class family. True. It's not particularly rare. I don't know what we are, like 20% of the population by large, or 15. I don't know. I don't read Barron's or whatever. And then he says, this is somebody who grew up comfortably middle class, upper middle class. His parents even read to him as a child. And that was his way of saying I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. And that in itself was really weird, because I don't remember telling the shrink that anybody read to me, because my parents said that I learned to read at 3. And so that's actually the cutoff date where all your infantile and toddler memory evaporates, right? As the brain wires itself with age. So I actually don't remember my parents ever reading to me, although I'm quite certain that they probably read Curious George to me or something like that at some point. So that was the argument for why there should not be clemency, because sorry. I thought that was like the obvious subtext, but yeah, that's what he was hinting at. There should be no mercy shown to me. I should have known better, and I shouldn't have needed to do this because my parents read to me. And another thing he said, my prosecutor, Stephen Hyman, it's interesting because he's a pariah now. There were huge, like, they're in protests, like people were sending crazy stuff to his house and his father's house. People were sending guillotines and pictures in effigy of nooses to him after Aaron Schwartz committed suicide. This is one disingenuous dude. So when he was trying to paint this picture of me as a sociopath, he read through this thing that I had written. It's called a frack profile. It's like this underground H-word magazine. There's an edition of it that comes out every year or maybe less. And every edition, they ask a bunch of questions to some famous H-word personality. And they picked me for this. And this was long after, a couple years after I was inactive. And so it was a really darkly cynical, sarcastic profile that was deliberately a mixture of, I would say, 75% truth and 25% hilariously crafted falsehoods. And I was consciously writing with the persona of a 5%er. I don't know if you're familiar with the religious sect. It's kind of like a Nation of Islam offshoot, but it's a little more mystical. It's very influential in the New York hip hop scene, like artists like Nas and stuff. And it's sort of like Afrocentrist and that whole sort of stuff. I don't want to get this wrong on an interview, but it was the persona that I adopted, both in like mentality and language, was this hardened kind of 5%er from the streets. And they kind of have this idea that, I don't remember what it is, like 80% are ignorant, 15% are wicked, and then 5% are woke in the traditional sort of pre-culture war sense. And
yes.
Jesus, I wish I had my phone in my hand right now so I could quickly look up Wikipedia, and somebody's not going to roast me for getting these numbers wrong because it's been so long since I read the Wikipedia page for it. But that's sort of essentially what it is. And my apologies for any inaccuracies. So I wrote it like that. And one of the things that I talked about, which again, it was a truthful answer to a question, but it was like, the response was crafted in this kind of hyperbolic way that I hoped to entertain and amuse the reader. Sort of like, I give this interview right now. I'm telling you the unvarnished truth, but I'm trying to make it interesting. That's kind of what I did with my frack profile, except there were actual things and sort of innocuous things that were described that never happened. Like, I actually described a couple of tongue-in-cheek crimes that were committed that were extremely outlandish, that would only be funny to somebody on a very practiced technical level. It described a criminal event, but there was no name of a victim or a year or anything like that. And I described some software I had written. So this is actually a specific example I can list. There is something you do to a victim, I guess people still do it today. It's called RMing somebody. And RM is the Unix command for deleting a file or a directory. So when you RM somebody, you've basically obtained access to their hard drive or files and you delete it all. It's just the most basic, straightforward method of vandalism, deleting somebody's shit, right? And so I went to some degree of length, like they said, like, what kind of software have you written that's interesting? And I said something like, well, I perfected the art of RMing because back in the day, before everything was solid state, you had magnetic disks with heads, spinning platters and heads. And I don't know if you remember when you'd be searching through your hard drive, you could hear a physical noise, right? Mm-hmm. Like you could hear this kind of like scratching or crackling as you're reading through the contents of the drive. So if you try to delete somebody's drive like you would format a drive, back in the day, you would some sort of very low grade crunching going on for 20 or 30 minutes while the hard drive was being erased in its entirety. So the joke was, I had perfected the art of RMing somebody so much that there was like a sophisticated algorithm that would essentially wipe the contents of the hard drive in little chunks. And it would do it at this staggered and precise way so that it would take this process that would normally last 20 minutes and you could actually hear it with your ears. And it would essentially spread it out over the course of a day so that there wouldn't be too much hard drive activity at any one time. So if somebody were sleeping or distracted and heard their computer whirring up unexpectedly because they're not using it, they wouldn't log in to see like, what's this activity that's responsible for the noise? And so this fictional piece of software was called Stealth RM, which is the most impossibly over-engineered way that you could fuck with somebody, right? Did that explanation make sense?
Yeah, it made sense.
And so this was brought up in court. Your Honor, he made this thing called Stealth RM. He went Walter White, sort of like fabricating, or maybe Walter White isn't like the right, like Nikola Tesla, like trying to create this crazy thing to stealthily wipe somebody's existence off the internet. So this is the sort of thing that Stephen Hyman brought up in court. There's another line from my profile where it asked me about my motivations. And I said something about the main thing that drives me is enjoying a sense of schadenfreude. And Stephen Hyman, the prosecutor, the assistant U.S. attorney, he gets up in court and he's talking to the judge. He said, Your Honor, I actually didn't know what this word meant, and I had to look it up in the dictionary. And Stephen Hyman is a graduate of Harvard, and he's also a professor there. So this is just like, This is just really kind of incredible. Like, I know that he knows what the word means, right? Like, it's a rhetorical argument, but it's just completely disingenuous. And he's going through the psych report, and he's saying, one of the things that I told the shrink, I guess indirectly, or they pried it out of me, was one of the reasons that I liked being indoors and on the computer was that, like, nobody would ask me dumb things like how tall I am. And Stephen Hyman, he has a bit of a limp. I've heard actually that it may be from polio, but he has a limp and he walks with a cane. And he said, Your Honor, nothing, be it a crippled leg or extreme height, like he taps on his, his gimp leg like he's fucking Clarence Darrow or somebody ready to slam dunk me in the Scopes monkey trial, right? And he's like, neither a crippled leg nor extreme height is an excuse for this kind of conduct. And it's just the most bad faith shit you could possibly imagine. But anyhow, like,
weren't they also trying to argue that you were a misogynist or something?
I don't know. I don't think that really came out. That was also sort of part of the persona, because I mentioned something about in the Prac profile, again, this mix of truth and falsehood. Like, I talked about, like, nowadays I only use the computer to go to MapQuest so I can print out directions to get drugs or find out how to get to a strip club. And like, I can't stand strip clubs. I don't care if anybody believes that or not, but it's just one of those things that sort of gets like taken out of context. This stuff is pretty easy to read as just like somebody's misanthropic Tumblr fiction, which in a kind of sense it was. Like, I poured time into this interview. I wanted it to be unlike any other frack profile out there. I wanted it to be the ultimate black hat profile. People talk about these sort of innocent things of curiosity that they do in their profiles, like I was fascinated by Fermat's last theorem, or like Fibonacci sequences, or reminds me of Claude Shannon, who invented information theory and it was like riding around a unicycle juggling. So like I wanted to be like the opposite of that in my profile. I just wanted to be just somebody with an absolute appetite for digital destruction, but who was now retired and had turned into a Luddite, which again is actually not entirely off the truth, because I kind of burnt out on this stuff and I haven't really cared much since about security at all. So yeah.
Another really bizarre element of this, you may recall, is that I was employed by Nancy Gertner.
This is something that we discovered in common once you found out the details of my case. And of course, Nancy Gertner is the judge who sentenced me. And that was sort of like a wow, it's a small world type of thing, right? That's something that we figured out really quickly the first time you came over and talked to me about the case. And we found that out in common. And it was, wow, that's kind of crazy. And she has a liberal record. I've learned not to attribute to malice what is just, I don't remember the exact adage, but what is like
explained
carelessness or stupidity, and I had a lot of resentment for it first and messed up with the sentencing. She actually wrote that her judgment of the monetary assessment against me for the restitution was in error. I was given essentially 2 days to appeal her sentence after she wrote a memorandum saying that she had been in error. And those 2 days, like one of them, I was self-reporting to prison. Imagine if you're like, I need to make this decision whether I appeal or not. I have 2 days. I'm going to prison tomorrow. And if I appeal, there's a chance that they hand the sentencing down to a different judge. So this judge who declared that she's in error doesn't necessarily get the case back. It could go back to somebody else. This other person could say, yeah, $171.5 million is really sort of crazy. Like, let's strike it down to $10 million, which is kind of almost the exact same number, functionally speaking. But then they could also jack up the amount of prison time.
I mean, what
right?
is even the purpose of this? Is like when people get a 400-year prison sentence, what are they even thinking when they do something like this?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know the law that well outside the scope of my own case. I think psychologically, maybe it sends some kind of message that reinforces there's not any possibility of parole or reconsideration. I don't know. Maybe they're hedging their sentences in case, like, Brian Johnson. Yeah. Maybe he'll succeed and somebody will live to 400 years in prison using his life extension techniques. And, that they would have one up the system.
Yeah. I mean, for me, working in Nancy Gertner's office was a definite moment of radicalization because
really,
without question, yes, because this was someone who was supposedly one of the good guys. And then there was a heroin related case, and there was some guy who'd been selling heroin, and the prosecution was really going hard on him. It felt like they were bringing up all of this criminally irrelevant information about how he had maybe cheated on his wife. His wife is in the courtroom. She's crying.
Right. Okay.
And his kids are there. And I'm thinking,
what the fuck does that have to do with anything?
I'm thinking, what the fuck does this have to do with anything? And Jesus, there's something really creepy about all of this. And then I remember Nancy Gertner was sentencing him, and she had this little preamble where she said, I think that these drug sentences are often unnecessarily harsh, but this is different. This is heroin. And heroin is a life-destroying drug. And this guy's crying and all of this stuff. And I'm thinking, is Nancy Gertner not aware of the irony here? That she's destroying somebody's life for selling a supposedly life-destroying drug. And she has no fucking idea why anyone would sell heroin. Yeah, I mean, the only thing about the story is just that working, I was like, if this is the good guy, then we have no hope.
She had a strongly liberal record, so my prosecutor looked up her record. Of course, I can't do it without a computer. I can't do any legal research on my own behalf with my restrictions. And my views on her have both sharpened and softened in different ways. So I've come to strongly believe now that some of her decision making was propelled by this sort of insouciance, where it was very clear from how she spoke about the facts of the case in the first sentencing that she just simply did not have a good command of the facts. And that did not at all align with the way she spoke about the case after the sentencing was adjourned. Because that's not a common thing, that the judge is like, whoa, hold up a second. I need to go back and read this and we're going to reconvene here, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that was one big problem. She did try to rectify her error. She gave down this sentence with $171.5 million, which ends up putting a lien against the entire value of my property, which I own full equity in, right? And most of that's my mom's money that she paid off this place, like paid off my mortgage once I was like no longer able to work. And all the funds that went into this apartment that you're in right now, like 100% above board, right? Like we have all the like 401k records going back for 30 years or whatever it was. So she imposes a sentence like that. I think to her it's just like an arbitrarily large number, not really thinking that this can really fuck me for the rest of my life. It's not just a matter of like I have to send a lot of money every month like every month I have to go down to the post office and fill out a money order with some many hundreds of dollars worth of cash, and I buy a money order and I send it to the clerk of the court in Massachusetts, and it just sort of goes into a black hole. Like I've always paid every month, I've always paid on time and in full, but nobody ever tells me the balance. I don't know how many of the $171.5 million remain. And I've asked multiple lawyers like, hey, can I get a balance? And I've actually been told, do not poke the bear. Everybody knows that you'll never pay it back. So if you ask how much is left, you're going to seem like a smartass. Just cool it, right? So when Trump was elected for the first term and I was watching MSNBC, I would notice Nancy Gertner appeared on TV a lot. And she would be out there criticizing whatever she deemed to be like a flagrant violation of jurisprudence or constitutional law, and she'd be interviewed by whatever MSNBC host. I don't know if it was like Rachel Maddow or Joy Reid or whoever. It's sort of like out of my memory now, but she was on TV enough times, and always be sort of vaguely triggering, right? Because You had somebody there who was supposed to be this calculated voice of ethics, who's clearly put a lot more effort into marshaling her thoughts going on to this MSNBC primetime show than she ever put into reading up on my case when the fate of my life's future was in the balance. It was in her hands, you know? And I actually wrote her a letter. I wrote her a letter a few years after everything happened. And I told her sort of like point blank, and she had retired. I think she went back through the academic revolving doors, and I think she was back to teaching at Harvard again. Like they all go back to Harvard, I guess, but Harvard is not really the place to be anymore. So, but 2016, Harvard was not under active attack from wealthy financiers and the US government. So it's a prestigious place to hang your academic laurels. So I wrote a letter to her basically saying, hey, I don't know what you think about the case now. And maybe you thought you just gave me this impossibly high restitution because a number was so large that it didn't really matter. And it would just mean that I'd pay some money every month. But the downstream effects of it are more disastrous than you can ever possibly imagine. My mother cannot leave any property to me right now. I have to fill out financial disclosure forms that are extremely invasive, and like they ask you things like you have to itemize anything in your apartment that costs more than, like, I don't remember if it's like $100 or $500. If you owe money or somebody owes you money, you have to itemize it. There's stuff for itemizing individual pieces of jewelry, yachts, mutual funds, like stocks, bonds, other financial instruments, gold bullion. And that's sort of like the expected stuff. But then they have questions on there like, do you expect to inherit anything? If so, how much and from whom? Right? And so, like, I don't need money. Like, I have a child now. My mom is only interested in like leaving money to her granddaughter, right? And like that's a big problem right now. There's not really a convenient way for me to just be like, hey, I'm not like a greedy person, just give this shit to my daughter. Like it's not really that simple. When the judge ordered me to get my psychological evaluation, I was effectively indigent, right? So I was living in this nice apartment that my mom paid off, and she was paying the maintenance because I wasn't working. My checking and savings account were like basically zero. Like I lived unemployment check to unemployment check. And the only asset that I had that was not like jeans or like weightlifting gloves or books or whatever the fuck I had in here. I had a 401k, which was not very well developed because I just started working at Morgan Stanley, and like, I had like probably not like $8,000 in my 401k as a result of a few years in Wall Street, not even being 25. And so when we filled out the financial disclosure form saying like, hey, you want us to get this psychological exam, which you've strongly hinted at, you said, I strongly recommend, which means if I don't get the exam, she's going to be pissed, right? So you got to get the exam to prove that you're not a sociopath. Like, we'd like to get the exam, but client has no money. Okay, provide proof. Okay, like here's all the assets. Worth $0, you got a 401k. And her response was very swift. It was like, he has a 401k, take it out of there. So I ended up taking $6,000 from my 401k that basically covered this psychotron test that I described to you earlier, along with like the subsequent therapist visit and then the Amtrak train to Boston and back. And yeah, that day was like, that cost over, I don't know, it cost like $5,000 or something. Like, there goes the 401k. I mean, like, I don't want to compare myself to somebody that has real serious trauma, but there's definitely financial trauma around it. I definitely became like a money in a mattress sort of person, like all like legal money, but like I'm sort of petrified to keep anything outside my checking account. I just like to spend money when I get it on something substantive. I was going to say one more thing.
Or that you wrote to Nancy Gertner.
So I wrote to her saying like, hey, I don't think you realize how much of a profound effect this has had on my life. And like, I don't think that, you really thought about this much, which is kind of like evidenced by the fact that it's appreciated that you admitted that you were wrong, but in assessing me this restitution. But at the same time, the reason that you assessed the restitution incorrectly in the first place was because you kind of half-ass this. You were very blithe about this decision that decided the fate of my life. And like a perfectly law-abiding citizen right now, as I was prior to being sentenced, except for some very minor exception. And my life is permafucked for a very long time because of this decision you made. I see you on the news posturing and lecturing morally about the law and the gravity of the law and the serious weight that hangs on the executors of the law. But the way that you handled my case was not like that. And I mean, look, I don't really remember exactly how I phrased this, but it was something to that effect. And I was hoping I'd get a response. I wouldn't have expected a response if she was still a judge, but she's now at Harvard. But I never got anything back from her. So it's kind of disappointing.
Would she have the power to reduce the restitution if she wanted to?
She wouldn't. This is one of these things where it's sort of like it's one and done. You got to take that appeal or there's not much you can do. Now, you could theoretically get a presidential commutation. Now, here's a funny thing. If I recall correctly, Nancy Gertner was like either roommates or best friends with Hillary Clinton in college. And so that was kind of on my mind for a little bit. Like Hillary almost maybe theoretically became president in 2016, but like not really. That was like a thought that came to mind. Like, wow, this woman she's admitted error and she may actually know the only person in the world who would be able to strike this off my record. But alas, were with her never came to pass.
Okay, so we're going back. Sure. We had this discussion about how this code that you wrote while you were high on ketamine had a catastrophic effect in your life. Sure. And you'd reached out to me recently with the article about the concerns regarding Elon Musk's drug use, specifically his ketamine use, and how a drug that can induce delusions could be extremely dangerous for somebody who has any sort of political power. And I'm also somewhat unsympathetic to any narratives where people's behavior is blamed on drugs, whether it's methamphetamine caused Nazi atrocities or amphetamine caused Jeffrey McDonald to kill his family. So on one hand, obviously drugs influence human behavior. Sure. Obviously people do things when they are on drugs that they wouldn't do if they were not on drugs. The flip side is I got so tired during the first Trump administration when people would bring up that some physician had prescribed him diethylpropion or that he was prescribed finasteride or whatever, and they would say like, or when
the
people
DHT inhibition is like, it's. I mean, look, there are studies that definitely point to that, although the effect of it would certainly not be quite as dramatic as some people would like it to be. I mean, for example, like I've consciously cut back on antihistamine use as a sleep aid, right? Like whether it's diphenhydramine, or was it chlorpromazine, or I'm trying to think now.
Chlorpromazine is an antipsychotic.
Is it also an antihistamine?
It might be. Maybe, well, there's chlorpheniramine.
It might be chlorpheniramine.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's, okay, man. So I am so rusty right now, like since becoming a dad. Like I haven't been on Arrowwood in like 20 years. This is embarrassing. I don't remember delusional parasitosis off the top of my head. I don't remember the names of like the basic histaminergic drugs, by the way, which I should know the name of that one because that's what they actually let you have in prison. They don't give you diphenhydramine. But anyhow, for example, I know that chronic use has been linked to cognitive dysfunction. Yeah. I mean, I knew that before you stressed it to me, but like after you sort of like you something clicked, right? I trust your counsel, and like this thing that I knew intellectually, I was like, damn, I really need to just stop using that unless it's like the last resort, you know? Yeah. So I didn't think that article was that bad. Like,
no, I actually agreed with it.
Fair enough.
And I guess it was more the overarching framework of using it as a tool to tar ketamine, as opposed to disagreeing with the thesis of the story, which is actually a pretty tame thesis. I'll try to very efficiently give you like the intro to my ketamine usage history.
Mm-hmm. So ketamine was like one of the very first drugs, like psychedelics, that I tried. I think basically my drug use history up until that point was I had drank, I had smoked weed, I had done GHB a few times because I had a college roommate that was a few grades above that probably manufactured it. I once did half a roll at a rave in Serbia that did not affect me at all because of my body mass. It just kind of like made me agitated and wonder why I wasn't having a fun time. And then I did ketamine for the first time. I have been afflicted by a morbid fear of dying since I was about 5 or 6 years old. It's really weird, man. It sounds sort of like crazy, but there was a show on TV called Rescue 911. I don't know if you remember that.
I'm familiar with it.
They had these episodes where like people get into life-threatening situations and then are rescued by paramedics and revived. Sometimes it's like the jaws of life or like CPR or stomach pumping or whatever. And so when I heard about heart attack things, like a heart attack was a thing and like your heart would stop pumping and you die. I was 6 years old, lying in bed in the middle of the night, continually feeling my chest to see if my heart was still thumping rhythmically. Of course, like the less you breathe and sort of listen for it, like the slower your heart beats, and then like it kicks up because there's like a fear response, and then you get like some kind of like tachycardia thing because you're like in this existential death loop. And for me, this sort of shit started happening when I was 6 years old. You know, you can believe it or not, but it was a thing. Like I've had very morbid thoughts about the existence. And, you know, I was probably like, I don't know, 10 years old when I heard, was it like a Seneca quote about like, you know, how can I fear death because where it is, I am not, or something to that effect. I think this is like the 10th thing I've probably misquoted in this interview so far. But, you know, this sort of very sort of rational, stoic argument against paralyzing fear of death, which is like, you know, how can you fear it if you don't exist, essentially, right? And that did not help me. When I switched from computer science to philosophy in school, I was actually focusing in neuroscience because I had like this very strong fascination with cognitive science. It wasn't really neuropharmacological. It had more to do with like, I was specifically into philosophy of mind. So like these philosophers like Thomas Nagel, who did the What Is It Like to Be a Bat, that describes echolocation. My mind is absolutely 0% visual imagination or imaginative. So like when I close my eyes and somebody says that canonical test of like, think of an apple with your eyes closed and what do you see? It's blank for me. I'm terrible at drawing because I have to reason it out. Like somebody tells me to draw a person and I have to actually inventory the anatomy, you know, like I'm like, there's a torso, there's 2 arms, there's a neck, there's a head, and then I have to think of the number of toes and fingers, and I have to remember that there's a metatarsal or a heel, and maybe there's like a, you know what I mean? Like I have to itemize, like I create a taxonomy to create this sort of like visual abstract representation before I want to like draw something from memory. Like I'm absolutely terrible at it. So when I would read this Nagel stuff, like what is it like to be a bat, and describing like the sense of echolocation that like is, I guess it's blind people actually use it to get around now, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyhow, so like this sort of thing about like the idea of like Cartesian duality and like the mind-body problem, and I was like into like analytic philosophy and A.J. Ayer and Wittgenstein and all this stuff. It went really good. It was really, really like juicy to my sort of like zero visual imagination, completely analytical mind, you know? And this is the same mind that I guess like strongly, like a strong monoglot when it comes to English. And I've learned like a couple languages to some casual degree of proficiency. The only one I really speak now, for example, with some degree of fluency is Serbo-Croatian. When I was a kid, I knew French and Spanish fluently because I had a nanny for a little bit, but then I forgot it. And then I learned Spanish again in prison in a few months and I forgot it because I don't use it. Like I kind of learned Italian to like maybe C1 proficiency and then in a semester of college, and then I didn't use it, so I forgot it. I'm really good at forgetting things that I don't use. I have a good memory, but I very rarely voluntarily recall things. And so it just kind of falls out. So this is good for my mind, like rumination about like the mind-body problem in specific. It was just this thing that I used to gnaw over in college. Like, you know, I had my first girlfriend and that was exciting, but you know, you have sex, and then I start thinking about like duality, like that's that. And then I drown those thoughts out by like getting into code. Like that's one of the things I've always really liked about computer code, is because I kind of don't like the term that much because it's overused, but it's a flow state, and it really drowns out all the sort of gnawing existential problems that sort of plagued me. I could really relate to reading works like Kierkegaard, right? Which I never really understood, because like he had the benefit of believing in a god, which I always thought was sort of like an escape valve or escape hatch, but that I didn't have as like a committed 6-year-old atheist. Anyhow, I got so deep into this cognitive loop, I ended up abandoning philosophy after getting a degree, because my mind was in like an insane morbid loop. And the first time I tried ketamine at a club, I remember coming home in a cab ride, and I wasn't that high, but I remember for the first time in my life, the fear of death had absolutely evaporated. And I remember just sort of like silently laughing at the universe. Like I remember watching the Manhattan skyline through the front of the windshield and just kind of laughing that like I had defeated this final level boss of like existential dread that I had been fighting for 15 years because I'd taken this dissociative anesthetic. And not only did it cure me for the time that I was acutely intoxicated, but it actually basically put the fear or the thought of death in my mind at bay for at least several years. It kind of instantly evaporated. And I think that one of the things that I ended up understanding, especially when I read that Carl Jansen book, Ketamine, like Dreams and Reality, and I'm not sure, like, I think it's a super good book. I don't know, like, you haven't expressed like a huge amount of enthusiasm about it.
Oh, I think it's very good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you just have like that's the patented understated Hamilton response where you it was kind of, it's the best introductory text ever written on ketamine. I think it's goes a little further than introductory, no?
Yeah, it goes further. But I mean, if you haven't read John C. Lilly, like this, it introduces you to.
I'm not a huge Lilly fan. I want to be, because like he's a godfather of that, but it's a little bit too granola for my taste. I love dolphins as much as the next person, and whales, and I'd like to be fucking zipping through the oceans with the blowhole, and I feel like I can relate to a whale. I feel like I can relate to animal life. So there's one of these things, like when I'm on K, I get like this very primal sense of empathy. So my hyper-literate mind that is always kind of like, by the way, I don't have an internal monologue, so I don't think to myself with some sort of like subvocal process. So my existential dread, it's really weird. It's not like I hear silently in my mind what happens when we hurtle into the abyss after we close our eyes for the last time. It's just like this weird abstract feeling of a void, which maybe for me like makes it even more terrifying, that like I'm afraid of a void, and like my mind is kind of like a void if I'm not doing something. So when I sort of started to read through the literature, and like, I think in the Jansen book, there's kind of like a few theses there of what happens in the ketamine experience, right? Like the very beginning phases of the drugs are like schizomimetic, right? Which is very apparent if you use it, right? Like you get like these hallmark attributes of a prodrome experience, followed by the rubbery skin and the feeling of disembodiment. And then, I've never gotten voices talking to me, but the one thing that really stands out like crazy is synchronicity, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a sort of classic delusion. And,
this is also core to Lilly's beliefs as well.
Maybe I didn't pay enough attention.
That's what Echo is. It's all about coincidence control.
Yeah, I don't know if I have to give it another read. I was like a little repelled. It went a little bit too far.
Well, it depends on what level you're trying to. I know what
happened to him biographically. I know about him sort of being locked into the airline bathroom, communicating with extraterrestrials and solid state entities. And I've never been that fucking deluded in my life. Like, So like I probably have some of the most ketamine experience for any like grounded person who hasn't dropped off the face of the earth in terms of sanity or like developed Olney's lesions, right? Like I may actually have some small Olney's lesions because like my memory is not quite what it used to be, but I don't know. I'll take a little bit of like chronic memory loss for, to sort of dispel like a chronic fear of death that kind of like paralyzes me and keeps me up at night. I'd like to be a little bit more of that like Socratic contented pig, right? And that's kind of what the drug did for me, like acutely and in the after effect. But I started to realize, you start off with the schizomimetic stuff, especially the synchronicity, right? And like you feel like disparate events that are contemporaneous, not only do they seem somehow significantly connected, but I think the more worrying thing is that there is often like this megalomaniacal sense that like these things are being like caused by you, right? And that's a frequent thing that I have. I consider myself super self-aware. Like I know myself really well. And if I try to analyze my thoughts or actions, it's very rare that I'm not able to very quickly triangulate on if I'm feeling a certain way, like irritated or unhappy. An answer is almost always at hand. I know if it's like hypoglycemia that's causing like the mild irritation, or like it's an insecurity that's been triggered. So I think what I'm trying to say is that like I kind of feel like I have expert knowledge on myself, and maybe that's kind of hedged the extent of the psychosis that I've experienced, right? Because like I'm very self-monitoring. Now, I'm not afraid to take psychological risks. I'm not afraid to surrender to a crazy trip, but like I kind of have this self-awareness that anchors me in. I've taken DMT. I haven't met the machine people yet. So there's like these sort of canonical events that you're supposed to get on like really high doses of certain kinds of drugs. I haven't gotten them, but I've gotten 95% of what is presented in the literature. And of course, the sort of the two extreme ends with ketamine that precede actual anesthesia are like the sort of out-of-body experience, which I do not get too often, but I do get the near-death experience extremely often. And that is what I realize that I go for. And I mean, I think that, like the Greek term of it is like thanatos, like a love for death. And I've realized that both as somebody who used to fear death and somebody who is prone to both chronic dysthymia and has been severely clinically depressed for years at a time for various reasons, many of them clinically related, I've realized that taste of death is extraordinarily palliative. And palliative is actually like an understatement, because it would imply that, there's sorry to sound like the OED, it would sound like, there's something that's been temporarily like assuaged, but the reality is that it's cured me. It's like a sort of thunderclap. So I don't want to sound like one of these Silicon Valley type lame self-experimenters, but like some of the personal reports that people talk about, like this is kind of like the only thing on the planet that can reliably cure extremely acute suicidal desire. Right.
Yeah.
Of course, if you're psychotic, it can also amplify it, right? Like if you're bipolar, like I've been with friends who have taken like a tiny bit of ketamine, and then I spent like the next minute trying to fucking keep them from hurling themselves out of the window while I'm like on twice the dose that they are, right? That was really important for me. So early on, and I don't want to sound like I'm posturing as some sort of like drug prophet, but early on, I like ketamine recreationally. I've enjoyed kind of doing it in social settings. So, you ramp up the dose, you go from schizomimetic, you sometimes hit the out-of-body experience, not so common for me, but then you get that taste of death from the near-death experience. And that I found immensely gratifying, because it sort of demonstrates that like, hey, the other side is maybe not that terrifying. And the other thing that I started to piece together after a couple years of ketamine use was I realized that I liked the experience. I loved really hard K-holes. Even like kind of bad trips, which I rarely had, were still very interesting to me. Plumbing the depths of my mind. And like, there is such extreme time dilation in a K-hole that if you approach it with more of a disciplined mindset to like excavate personal thoughts and feelings, like it's the equivalent of being able to go like spelunking in your own mind in a way that like it's just not really possible with other drugs, right? Like with DMT, for example, DMT as a very strongly visual hallucinogen, it's like a rocket that you're fucking strapped to, right? You're not doing anything. You're there for the ride, and it's about 8 minutes, or it depends on how many tokes you've managed to like choke down. But it's strongly voyeuristic, and the K-hole, depending on your level of experience, can be strongly voyeuristic if you're not prepared to do the work. But if you are prepared to do the work, it's sort of like finding King Tut's tomb in your own mind. And so I found that
that's a good analogy.
I don't know.
Have you read Journeys into the Bright World? Have you read Journeys into the Bright World?
No.
You've got to read Journeys into the Bright World.
Well, I'll definitely take your recommendation.
Okay.
Give me 1 second. So that was immensely attractive. When I used to party with my friend Albert, so the media gets something about our story really wrong. I was partying a lot on a weekly basis, maybe 4 nights a week. I would say usually 2 of those nights were just like a few drinks, and maybe a couple of nights were like something like ketamine or some kind of designer phenethylamine. But you know, the real crazy blow is like I was keeping things together, right? Like I came into work at Morgan Stanley hurting on many mornings, because that's like nobody can kind of like party that hard and not kind of limp to work, right? But I mostly like I kept my job together, and nobody really knew what was going on. But there's just no way you could go super hard and hold down a job at a place of that caliber, right? Like it wasn't rocket science, but like you can't really, unless you start doing something like meth, right? Like, which I wasn't, you know, I had my limits for stimulant recovery, right? Like this is 20 years ago. So like I was taking modafinil, that was still like a research chemical at the time that wasn't particularly well known, or I try to go really low on like dexedrine or Adderall. So I was very, very careful, right? Because I realized that I could party at the pace that I was going and easily keep up work, but I didn't want to turn into like some kind of like person addicted to Pervitin, right? Like ready to take over the world, right? Right. So, you know, I didn't want to turn into a tweaker. So that kind of limited me there too, like as to how hard I could go. But so these blowout parties that got like described in, say, like Rolling Stone, they sort of really played it up, because again, it is Rolling Stone. But Albert and I used to have like maybe two or 3 weekends a year where we would just go super hard, and we get like this sort of cornucopia of drugs. And, you know, it would be something like between 4 people, it might be like, I don't know, like a few, like maybe a few 8 balls for whatever random women were there. And then, you know, probably like 15 or 20 grams of ketamine, like a couple grams of MDMA, like maybe like several tens of grams of psilocybin. And yeah, it was just kind of like balls to the wall from roughly like, you know, like a Friday to a Sunday type thing. And I always used to leave these events first of all, it's like hell of a lot of fun, right? But and part of that's because we did it relatively sparingly, but I used to leave these weekends and go back to work despite having like a minimum of like sleep and food during that time. And keep in mind, I was regularly going to the gym. I've gone to the gym on ketamine and GHB and cocaine and crystal meth.
Yeah, you've told me that you could work out better when you were on ketamine, or that you could isolate muscle groups more effectively.
Okay, so yeah, I don't even want to like go down that rabbit hole. But one of the crazy things that is very underreported about ketamine is that you have extreme muscle isolation control. Like if, you know, you take something like your chest, where you can kind of like, if you have a bit of chest muscle, you can flex your pec, but like your pectoral muscle, like there's an upper portion, lower portion, right? Like this is something that like a really seasoned bodybuilder can maybe like can sort of like contract the top part of their chest only. But I use this as an example. You have muscle groups that have 3 heads, like the tricep, or you have the deltoid, and like you kind of, you know, anatomically how these joints are working when you lift a machine. And when you normally work out, you feel them sort of, and you work out properly, you sort of feel them strongly isolated, or maybe like a little bit more detailed than that. But one of the things on ketamine is you have like some sort of extreme body awareness. It's just very hard to describe. And it's also very strange because you feel disembodied at the same time, right? Because that is one of the primary features of the drug, is like a feeling of disembodiment. So it's almost like you're like having really fine-grained control over somebody's body that's not yours, but at the same time you can feel every sinew and joint and working. I don't know how much sense that makes to you.
It makes sense,
Okay.
yeah.
So I used to do these, like, we did these crazy weekends, and I used to feel so good after flying. Is usually like, you know, flying back from Miami to New York, and it's work at Morgan Stanley on Monday morning. And I used to feel great. And for a little while, I had this operating theory that I was like somehow with this extreme buffet of drugs that I was somehow resetting my mind. And I used to find that like a drug binge, and keep in mind that like I'm very strangely risk averse. Like I do research things, and I research the bounds of what might be like potentially fatal, and I know about harmful drug interactions and things like that, and I avoid them. I like to push the boundary of what I believe and know to be safe, right? And I've kind of ramped up my own drug use in my youth to push those boundaries. But anyhow, I would feel great coming back from one of these binges, and I thought it was like some sort of generic psychological reset, right? At first I thought like, oh, maybe I'm just like overloading myself, right? Like I'm blowing out every 5-HT subreceptor, and maybe I'm just like getting some sort of like neuro cascade that is just flushing my brain clean, you know, like a reset. And so over time, I isolated this down to ketamine, right? Like I thought it was just like, yeah, I'm somehow binging and like in a abstract way, like I'm purging the demons, or I'm engaging in this Dionysian rapture where I'm excising this Apollonian side of my personality that sort of like dominates my normal sober days, right? Like I felt like a wild man who was like making a beast of himself to like rid himself of the shackles of a materially bound mind. I don't know if I thought about it in those, I kind of thought about it in those terms, maybe not those words, but over time, because I am pretty good with knowing myself, I realized that no, this is not a result of all these drugs together. It's ketamine. And like for a while, I used to think the whole idea of sort of like depressed state after a roll, I used to think that was like a bit of a myth. Like, oh, you had shitty drugs. Yeah, okay, maybe all your serotonin is supposed to like dump out, but like it shouldn't really like put you in a funk. But I was actually usually doing MDMA with K. Like I'd be taking K before, during, and after. And I never got the downtime. And then like one time, for example, I just did the MDMA alone, and it was just like I did every other time, and, you know, body weight controlled, like sort of like milligram for pound of body weight. And like, I just did it alone. And like the next day I woke up and I was like, fuck, am I getting old, or is there just like a hole in my soul right now? You know, it was just, you know, I know what anhedonia feels like, and it's not pleasant, but this is like, you know, way worse. Like being unable to partake in pleasure is like much better than just kind of feeling like pleasure doesn't exist, which is kind of like how I would characterize like a bad day after MDMA. So what I'm trying to say here as I ramble is that like I isolated the effects of this great feeling to heavy ketamine use. And over time, I did things like when S-ketamine came out, I tried that. I got absolutely nothing. I binged like a wild man on it, and the next day I felt nothing. And I've also done like sort of small amounts, and there's like not much of an effect. So, you know, I have some pretty strong opinions on the use of ketamine, you know, to treat depression. And it's, you know, anecdotal. It's sort of like N=1 stuff, but there seems to be a very strong pattern for at least me personally, where it has to be racemic, and there has to be an NDE level amount in order to do it. And I think most people that don't have any experience with like this drug or any drugs, like they kind of know the hallmarks of like what happens with a near-death experience. Like people come back, they realize that life is short. They count their blessings. They itemize the things in their life that are harmful that they need to cut out immediately. They thank the people that they love. They remember to hug them every day when they go to work. They remember to apologize for things that have nagged at them for years. Like it's kind of like, you know, some sort of like, I don't know, like Jordan Peterson on steroids if you like remove all the kooky shit that like he talks about, you know, beyond like the clean your room and respect your parents sort of stuff, right? So yeah, I kind of arrived at this before there seemed to be like literature about it, and I didn't really have many formal thoughts on using it for depression, because it's like sort of like I came to understand this very strongly, that like there was a rebound effect for ketamine. Like there was this antidepressive halo that would, you know, the first day or two after, there would be almost like this hypomanic or hyperthymic rebound, right? Where you're just like, you're ready to fix everything, right? And you're just ready to grab life by the balls and like turn over a new page and just do everything that you ever thought that you're supposed to do but felt too lazy or unmotivated to do. So that's the first day, and then like, you know, it kind of wears off, it tapers off a little bit over time, but like you're good for at least like a good couple like weeks or maybe even a month. And I remember I thought about this a lot, but you know, I'm also like computer programmer and heavy recreational, occasionally heavy recreational drug user. So it's like, when you come to an insight like that, like who do you tell? I mean, I'm not the sort of person that hops on like blue light and starts like ranting about experiences. Like I've read a lot of experiences. I've never submitted one. That's sort of not the sort of person that I am. But, you know, so I have felt like this is some sort of, I mean, it's as close as it comes to a panacea for acute, immediate relief of severe clinical depression and suicidal ideation. But at the same time, you know, it's also troubling. There's a lot of amplification of megalomania. A lot of this has to do with like, especially the synchronicity, like the idea that there are events happening, important events happening in the world that are somehow caused by, I don't know, your existence or something that you've done, right? And I remember one of my previous partners, she used to make sure that I would, like, she'd basically take my phone away from me when I was, you know, anesthetized, so to speak, because I would just behave in this very rash and impulsive fashion that I never would otherwise. You know, if you're in a hole, you're kind of like, you're impeded from really engaging in much social interaction at all. But like if your level of ketamine intoxication is somewhat more moderate and you have some degree of control over your cognitive faculties, you become an extremely impulsive person. Ketamine's like an idea factory, and like, I don't know, I like to say like, you know, 70% of them are just rubbish, and then like some number of them are promising, and maybe a couple are really good, but like some of them are like absolutely terrible. And it's also, you know, I don't know how many people understand the difference between like retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia, but of course anterograde amnesia is what you experience under the effects of ketamine. And, you know, your mind is racing forward with all these ideas, and at the same time it's almost like a garbage sweeper on the street behind you, right? Like you're showering out ideas, and this street sweeper truck is coming behind you, like erasing your memories. And like it's kind of like it's a race to try to communicate to somebody that you're with, like some sort of profound insight that you've had, and usually you're stunted from doing so because you've become completely inarticulate and you're babbling, and you kind of like from an outward perspective, you look like a psycho, but you've had like a really profound insight, and you are just trying to race to get the words out, and it's coming really slowly, and your memory is just like it's vanishing behind you, you know? It's very strange. Like, it is not like another, it's like very few drugs where you kind of like you trip, you know. Think about, like, I don't know, Steve Jobs having an idea on LSD. Like, these are things that you kind of retain when you come down. And on ketamine, you are in a state of acute psychosis, for lack of a better word. It's sort of like a benign psychosis because you are so sedated that you're not really able to like move around and hurt yourself much. I mean, okay, you don't want to do it in a hot tub or like operate heavy machinery because like you'll fall asleep or drown or, you know, whatever. But if you're on a couch or something, you know, you're basically like a raving psychopath, except that you're not glib enough to rave and you're not able-bodied enough to like, you know, jump off the couch. But in an age with smartphones, you can do some dumb shit. You can send people some dumb shit. You can, I mean,
you can ruin your life very easily. We were talking about it. We were discussing the Shayla Love article and this idea that Elon Musk's behavior might be a ramification of his ketamine use. But anyway, this is not even some kind of like grand revelation. Like, oh my God, Elon Musk does drugs. He's tweeted about it. It's been leaked in tons of his DMs. He's admitted himself to doing ketamine. It's clear.
But he does it. It's not like, it's not regulated. It's at home.
Yeah.
As he specifically said, it's at home. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's clearly doing it in a both recreational and maybe a pseudo-medical capacity.
Let me riff for a second, and then maybe you can steer me, okay? This is on, right?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So, like, I think personally that one of the things that has really worked well for me with taking a huge variety of drugs, taking large amounts of drugs. Of course, that is somewhat body weight and, you know, body mass dependent, but, you know, taking such a wide variety and high doses and sometimes different combinations, I have a pretty good handle on myself. And there's never been a time in my life that I've had like a bad trip or freaked out. I'm pretty prepared when it comes to stuff. So like when I was a little more active, you know, you'd always want to have something like a Klonopin on hand or like Seroquel. And it's funny because like these are not particularly exotic medications. Like people with real issues take them on a regular basis, you know, like people that take like a couple milligrams of Klonopin every day, like it's Fruity Pebbles or something. But like these are incredibly potent drugs if you don't have some sort of serious tolerance to benzodiazepines. Like they will end a serious trip, right? So this is something, for example, that I, attempting to be, you know, a good Boy Scout, Eagle Scout, whatever, you know, you keep something like this nearby in case something goes wrong. And like, I never actually had to use those in an emergency, right? Like I used Seroquel. I used my Seroquel, like one of the only times I ever ended up using it, which is not to like abort an LSD trip or something like that. I actually used it the night before I went to prison. I had to self-report. So I'm living in New York and I get designated to Seattle, which is 3,000 miles away. It's as far from New York as you can possibly get in the continental United States. So it was like a clear instrumented move by the Bureau of Prisons to make me go as far away as possible from home, to like isolate me from family and friends, which doesn't really work because I have family in Vancouver, Canada, and I also have friends on the West Coast in Seattle and in California because like I'm a computer person. So like Seattle is not quite as far as like they would have been better sending me off to Mississippi or something, right? Like that would have been more isolating and terrible. So anyhow, they designate me there, and you have two options. If you can either fly there, or you can either transport yourself there to self-surrender on the day that you're supposed to of your intake, or you can like surrender locally, and they'll usually do something called diesel therapy, which is like they'll take like 2 months to get to Seattle, and you'll travel shackled in a like con bus where you're like you go 5 miles every day to the next county jail, and you like sleep in each one on a tiny cot, and you're not allowed to have property and all that. So like the only intelligent thing to do is like buy yourself a plane ticket. And what I did was I bought a plane ticket to Seattle, booked a night in a hotel, and I took a Seroquel, like my last night of freedom. Like it was like the only pharmacological way I knew of guaranteeing that I would get my, doctor approved 8 hours of of uninterrupted sleep in my final day of freedom. But so what I'm saying is like I kind of had these things as fire extinguishers or emergency brakes, and I never had to use it. But I think something like ketamine becomes really, really dangerous if you don't have some high degree of self-awareness to check your impulses, right? I remember how powerful I felt at certain moments. For example, I used to get so fucked up on ketamine. And by the way, we've already established I have actually been able to write working computer code and execute it on ketamine. The infamous court incident just happens to be I was so messed up I couldn't even do that. Mm-hmm. But I have been able to do computer development and debugging work of various sorts on lower doses of ketamine. To give you an example, sometimes I was so messed up on ketamine that I was unable to spell, but I was able to type my password via muscle memory. Mm-hmm. So I actually consciously chose a password where my fingers were able to kind of like roll across the keyboard in a particular pattern. It's just a like sort of random string of like numbers and letters, but like if you look at them on the home row, they're all relatively close together. Like you can hit all the keys without much vertical movement of your fingers. So imagine like, you don't remember what your password is, but you still have muscle memory, which goes back to what we were talking about, like incredible physical awareness. I've watched people take K for the first time and they'll start doing like kung fu moves or something. Like they took like a boxing class, like they boxed for the last time 15 years ago, and you feel like you're ready to like do these movements. Like it's just something that unlocks inside you. So I would log into the computer with this muscle memory and not remembering what my password is. Like if I thought to remember it, I simply wouldn't. And there's things that you can do. And I remember waking up after a ketamine binge and I would have 50 browser tabs open. And mind you, this is way more impressive 20 years ago. If your web browser had 50 open tabs, it's like the hallmark of psychosis, right? People just do these frenetic deep dives and everything looks interesting and you click on every link and that link is a new Wikipedia page and then you follow the references and then you get distracted and then you Google something else. It's just like the sort of meme of the crazy person with the whiteboard and there's like arrows pointing in every direction and conspiracy theories are being formed and theories of everything are being unlocked. And as I sort of alluded to before, you're developing a TOE, theory of everything, that's like sort of like the unspoken key to unlocking reality, but your memory is also kind of like being wiped out behind you at the same time. So it's like this race to stay ahead of it, and you're just like frantically researching, and it's crazy town. And the thing is, like, if you don't have the self-awareness to sort of know that like, hey, this is a thing that I do and maybe I need to wait a little bit or like touch grass, so to speak. And in this sense, I mean touch grass, like get off the keyboard or put down your phone and just like close your eyes for a little bit, right? And just try to passively absorb the experience, because you can just get very flawed ideas based off of assumptions and intuition, like this whole synchronicity stuff. Words start to take on strange meanings, right? Like one of the hallmarks of like schizophrenia and also ketamine trips is like you have these things like glossolalia, right? And like you're impulsively like repeating syllables and words, and like certain syllables and words start to mean things. And if you hear something, the intonation of a particular sentence or the ordering of a particular sequence of words will start to take on some sort of like cosmic or divine importance, right? And if somebody tells you something, you can read it like the completely wrong way. Like something innocuous can start to sound like prophetic or celestial, and you can be you can be talking to somebody and you can be having some sort of serious conversation, and your complete inability to like decipher context and tone in that conversation can really cause you to say somewhat disastrous things. And I kind of sometimes had this feeling of like, wow, thank God I'm just kind of like a nobody. And I imagine, like, what would it be like if you gave this stuff to somebody, like, unwittingly, right? Like a person of power. I almost feel weird saying this because I don't want to give somebody an idea, but I've always thought, like, why are people not being shot with ketamine darts, like low amounts of it? Like, it's the ultimate way to introduce a streak of irrationality and erraticism and just, possibly sink somebody in terms of like blowing up an evening or event or a relationship. And it would just be this way that, if you were able to absorb some through the skin, right? Like, you could probably administer something like this to somebody in a clandestine fashion. And it's so short acting, and it is so imperceptible at a light dose that it can just cause like this potentially fatal glitch in reasoning that could really mess up decision-making process at like a crucial point. Yeah, I don't know if this is... and I've kind of had these thoughts like about like weaponizing. It's like you hear about nerve gases and toxins and truth serums, and like the literature on that as much as everybody else. Giving somebody something like this unwittingly, you could really cause somebody to act very bizarrely in a self-destructive capacity, and it's very possible that the person would not really know it. They might think it's like a temporary rush of power or self-importance, right? It could be a way to like force a hand of impulsivity.
Well, that touches on a few interesting things. One is that they have explored virtually every pharmacological class as potential chemical weapons, and I am not aware of anyone studying NMDA antagonists for that purpose. So that's the first interesting thing. Second interesting thing about that is this was kind of a conspiracy theory from the very beginning with Marcia Moore and John C. Lilly and the role of ketamine in the New Age movement, that this was kind of part of this broader hot tub diplomacy initiative at Esalen, that you could promote the fall of the Soviet Union with American New Age values. And there was a CIA whistleblower named Miles Copeland, and he wrote this insane book called The Game Player, where he talks about this program at the CIA that there's no...
What's an insane book? Is this something that you should recommend to me after, or is this like...
Well, certainly some sections of it are very interesting. So you can't corroborate any of this, but he claims that there was something called OHP, or occultism in high places, and that they had done this program to figure out how to influence people and change their beliefs. And the outcome was you can either infiltrate their religious leader or their therapist. And the medicalization of ketamine is almost like an interesting ramification of that, in that it's medicalized. So Elon Musk can publicly say, yeah, I'm using ketamine. It's a therapeutic drug. It's prescribed by a physician. I'm sure it is. There's no shortage of physicians that will medicalize any amount of ketamine that Elon Musk wishes to use. But if it's having a catastrophic effect on his ability to reason, it would be such a beautiful way of interfering with somebody. Although this is a bit paranoid and conspiratorial.
So here's the thing. When I mentioned this last thing, when I talked about like how I've sometimes imagined, I haven't really thought in a great deal of like the method of administration or the route. Like, could this be like aerosolized in some fashion, or would it be better as like, could you DMSO some ketamine to somebody in a handshake, right? be very easy for somebody with self-control to like mutually poison themselves and an unknowing person with ketamine, and like they could both be high, and the person that knows what's happening would have like enough control to be able to like steer the situation, right? As to the person who has no idea that they've been somehow rendered mildly to moderately like irrational. It's so unlike any other thing out there, right? You know, I've gone through most of like the receptor types in terms of effect, whether it's GABAergic or like nicotinic or muscarinic or serotonergic or dopaminergic or, you know, cannabinoid. So none of these things work in the same way. You give somebody a stimulant and it sharpens them. You give and I'm speaking in very broad strokes here. You give somebody a stimulant, it sharpens them. You give something like acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, right? Mm-hmm. And you just sort of cause like panic, right? Like you can read like Alexei Navalny's account of the poisoning, and like it's like this feeling of impending doom and death. And it's not a state in which you're going to feel like you can do business as usual, right? If you dart somebody like your target and you give them something that just makes them extremely confused and makes them feel like they're going to die, that's not really particularly useful if you want that person to become like some kind of instrument of chaos, right? And so like NMDA antagonists, like at least in my own sort of, you know, again, N=1 experience, it seems to be one of the only things that in a light dose can cause very irrational behavior making, possibly without like very strong awareness that this effect is even happening, right? It can be so subtle. What's really important is how critical the decision is being made, because like this attack on somebody on their couch watching Ow My Balls or whatever idiocracy show is like dominating the airwaves now, like it's not going to do any damage, right? Like you give somebody a sort of, you know, a metaphorical lobotomy, or maybe that's saying a little too, like an emotional, you know, you give them like an emotional wallop, right? You know, ketamine brings out this sort of like very animalistic side and rashness. It brings out rashness. It just in a way that is simply not debilitating if the dose is light enough. And like I said a couple minutes ago, like it does, I feel a little bit self-conscious spitballing this idea with you, right? I'm looking at your face right now, and it doesn't seem like you think that I'm like off my rocker. Like I've thought about this quite a bit, and like, you know, I haven't tried anything, but it really seems like if there was some sort of like Cold War type weapon that might be used to trigger some sort of pandemonium, whether like low or high grade, this could be the way to do it if the vector of administration were like appropriately efficient or realistic or plausible.
And we have that right now, don't we?
I don't want to necessarily speak to like specific cases, but I think one of the things that smartphones and technology have done, it's really lowered the bar to what you can do on these things. So like to give you an example, you think of the sort of classic case of like a little kid playing around, fucking around with the TV remote at the hotel and manages to order like a porn video. Like they don't really know what they're doing. They're just hitting buttons repeatedly, but somehow they manage to like order Debbie Does Dallas for $5.99, and like it's a 3-year-old kid just playing with a remote, right? And I think like 20 years ago when phones were not really smart and you had to text, right? Like auto correction and auto prediction is a big thing. So when I operated under the influence back in the day, I tried to keep quote unquote business and pleasure separately, but I did do some technical work under the influence. And by that, I mean specifically ketamine, only because like I liked ketamine so much that I did a lot of it, and I couldn't always abandon whatever I needed to do at the moment. So there was a barrier back there. There was like a barrier to like being able to log into your keyboard, to be able to use a full-size keyboard. There was no spell check. There was no auto correction. There was no auto suggestion. There was no grammar check, right? Your ability to emulate a sophisticated mental process of somebody who was sober and non-delusional was very restricted back then. Take something like speech to text, for example, right? I've never used it once in my life, and I get very irritated when people use it because like they steamroll you in text conversations, and it's like, dude, I'm actually typing this fast, like, and I don't need the wall of text. Like, you just okay. Regardless of which, this is another thing. I think I mentioned to you earlier that the faculty of spelling and numerical facility is the first thing to disappear on K, and then probably the next thing to go is the ability to speak. So I think for a lot of people, like, you lose this sort of literacy before you lose your capacity to communicate verbally. And I'm not a scientist, and I haven't read any theory for this. Maybe it's, so to speak, like it's some kind of process that's, higher up the brainstem, to speak figuratively, right? You lose your ability to type before you lose your ability to speak, which is perhaps some sort of like less sophisticated mechanism of communication that's more generically mammalian. Am I making any sense?
You're making sense. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I think that now with modern technology, so I mentioned before autocorrection, autosuggestion, you can really emulate coherence on some of these drugs in the way that you would not be able to make plausible communications, like as if they were coming from like a sober, hinged mind. And I think also this is sort of theoretical because like I said, I've never used speech to text in my life, but I can imagine a situation where somebody's lost the ability to type or read and they're still able to activate Siri or whatever it's called, and they're able to speak out some kind of message that is then transcribed and sent. And, technology is pretty advanced now, right? Like you can say something and it gets transcribed with proper grammar and punctuation and syntax and all that. Basically what I'm saying is it's a lot easier to LARP as a sober person now in a state of acute drug intoxication than it used to be like even 10 or 20 years ago. So the danger that somebody is able to attempt to conduct business that they should only really dare do in a sober or, a hinged state of mind. This was just something that was like a little bit out of bounds or like impossible some time ago, that technology could essentially help somebody who's completely intoxicated or perhaps deranged, like masquerade as like a coherent person. And I don't really keep up too much with like real consumer technology, but like I know that these devices also have like disability, accessibility functions to help with like, impaired eyesight and impaired dexterity and hearing. And I can only imagine that like there's a lot of thought that goes on in a company like Apple or Samsung to try to streamline the ability to like correct their mistakes as they type and to use their devices. And some of these acute states of psychosis that might be caused by a drug like ketamine probably have significant overlap with legitimate cognitive impairments and disabilities. This isn't really a conversation I've had with anybody before in any serious depth. I've been sort of tossing it around in my mind. It's kind of worrisome because like I really, really, really think highly of ketamine when used in a controlled, responsible fashion as being not only super fun and psychologically rehabilitative if used properly, but like I also recognize like the dangers, and like, for example, it is a psychologically addictive drug. I've had multiple friends who have become addicted to it, just like loading up syringes, one after another, preloaded syringes, and like doing intramuscular ketamine. You slam it down, you go into a hole, you wake up, you don't even remember if you were in a K-hole, but you see that there's like another syringe that hasn't been used. Psychosis is intoxicating. I think this is something that you don't understand as somebody if you had a clean bill of health. Like before I took ketamine, the idea, and I do have a relative who suffers from paranoid schizophrenia, and he has many times been resistant to taking his prescribed medication. And I remember earlier on in my life, it used to be an enigma to me, right? Like you have this person who cannot function, who gets committed, right? And they know that taking this drug is going to basically, okay, maybe there's some side effects like weight gain and sluggishness and loss of libido, but surely it must be better to like suffer from those pitfalls than to like be in a straitjacket or a padded room. And there's a reason why people pick the straitjacket in the padded room, is because, you know, if you've taken ketamine to any high degree, you know that those schizomimetic effects are intoxicating. It's thrilling, it's edifying, it is like ego magnification at times like nothing anybody has ever experienced. It's not like MDMA where it's pure love. It's not like LSD where like you're looking at the connective fiber of the universe. It's not like DMT where like the machine elves are showing you like a secret alien codex that also has the key to the universe, but like somebody locked it away and forgot where it was, right? Like this is ego enforcing in a way that like not even cocaine or like meth can, like those drugs can cause these ego issues, but like it has to be very high repeated doses. Like it's not like, you know, a casual sort of dose of ketamine that can really like flare up the megalomania, and the megalomania can really spike even without an accompanying strong nosedive in cognitive faculties. And that's I think now I'm sort of like working my way to my fear right now, is that like, yes, you can get by with, especially with the assistance of technology. And if you don't have people looking out for you, if you're not self-aware, if you don't have people who are friends who are checking your impulses and guiding you and giving you negative feedback about destructive patterns, and you have technology that helps you do your daily tasks, and you don't have clear policies where you drop your phone or put it somewhere where it's inaccessible while you do your ketamine, you're really in danger of like falling prey to these fleeting impulses. They go away quickly, right? But like with today's technology and today's patterns, you see the way that people, like, their lives are ruined over a tweet, maybe not even one that they write themselves, but maybe they just forward, right? Like you can fat finger your way into forwarding some kind of crazy Nazi meme, and like this sort of stuff would like kind of end your professional career a few years ago. I don't know about now, but like this is something you could actually do by accident, by being clumsy, right? And so this momentary fleeting impulse that makes something seem so right or so true or makes so much sense, if you don't check yourself, if other people don't check you, if you still have your fingers on the dials, and you know, you can, it's 2025, you can break a lot of things with a single press of a button or a single, you know, keystroke on a touchscreen phone.